of a little bit of a catch-all and includes some community science presentation about loons and bycatch presentation and some presentations about at-sea surveys. So I'm going to kick it off here to Griffin Archambault from the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation. Go ahead. Anytime
Awesome.
you're ready.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this talk. My name is Griffin Archambault. I'm the research biologist at the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation in New York. And my presentation today is titled The New York Annual Loon Census, Knowns, Unknowns, and What We Hope to Learn. So what is the census? The census is a community science event that occurs on the third Saturday of each July from 8 to 9 a.m. And this has happened every year since 2001. During the census, volunteer observers count and age loons on a water body, which can be a lake, a pond, or a river. They age those loons and they record behavioral observations. The census is in mid to late July because the vast majority of chicks will have hatched for the year and will be on the water for counting. And there are several amazing organizations and individuals historically who have helped coordinate the census, with their logos pictured here on the slide. Most worth acknowledging is Nina Schock, who is ACLC's founder. So this is a real comment that we received on a social media post about the census. Sometimes people ask, what does the census actually do? What has it accomplished? These birds have survived since the dinosaurs, so it is written. Why do we need to count them now? Obviously, they're going to be here forever, even after man is no longer here. So what is the point? So the census provides us an annual snapshot of loon occupancy and reproductive states. It provides insight into potential population trends across New York, and it occurs on a very large spatial scale. Additionally, the methods that we use in New York are very similar, if not identical, to other regions, so we can compare our trends to other regions across the species range who do a loon census very commonly on the same exact day at the same exact time. But why loons? Why are we counting loons specifically? So loons are a sentinel species. They are top trophic level predators in aquatic ecosystems, and they're very long-lived, meaning they accumulate high levels of contaminants over their long lives by eating lots of small organisms that have smaller amounts of pollutants in their bodies. And loons are susceptible to pollution and other threats or other characteristics of lakes like water clarity, which makes them a sentinel species because their presence and reproductive success on a water body can reflect the health of that ecosystem. Loons are also state listed as a species of special concern in New York, so the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation needs to understand the loon population within the state to make management decisions. But why am I talking about loons at this conference? Despite their linkage with pristine lakes in northern areas, if you look at their life history, you may wonder why their strongest association is commonly with lakes. When fledging in their first year of life, juveniles fly out to the ocean and they spend the first few years of their lives there. Once they reach sexual maturity, they spend about 6 months of each year on the ocean, and the remaining 6 months are spent in the breeding regions. So despite their association with northern freshwater lakes in their breeding plumage, loons can largely be thought of as seabirds that fly inland to breed before returning back to the ocean. So 2025 was a great year for the census. Here's a map that shows all of the census observations we received in 2025, with orange circles showing observations of chicks or immatures, so there was offspring present. Blue triangles show observations of only adult loons, no offspring present. And black squares show an observation where there were no loons of any age observed. And as you can see, this map shows the entire state of New York, because this is the New York Annual Loon Census. Even though we are the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation, we are happy to receive observations from anywhere in the state, because as you can see in this slide, loons breed well outside of the blue line of the Adirondack Park within New York. And this is our first year ever counting 1,000 or more loons in the state. We had over 800 observers submit over 400 reports from 306 unique water bodies, and we counted a total of 1,059 loons in 2025. In the census, we are largely looking at occupancy, which here I define as the presence of a species at a particular site or across a defined geographic area. And in this case, we are defining occupancy in terms of multiple states. So the first state is offspring present. Again, saw on the map, there were a lot of cases of that in 2025. We had 83 water bodies that had offspring present, or adults only, where there are adult loons, but there's no evidence of offspring or reproduction during that survey, of which we had 155 water bodies in 2025. And then the last occupancy state is no loons present, and we had 68 water bodies that fell into that state for 2025. Even though we have a lot of loon data in New York, the carrying capacity of loons in the state is a really hard thing to figure out. There are thousands of lakes in New York State, and we only have census data for several hundred. And of these few hundred lakes, many do not have samples over a very long period of time to determine long-term occupancy trends. There are many lake and landscape scale variables that influence loon habitat quality and occupancy, including lake size, presence of suitable nest sites, water clarity, or the occupancy of neighboring lakes and neighboring territories by other loons. And so as an example on this slide, these two lakes obviously have very different physical characteristics, and there are differences between the two lakes in terms of loon occupancy, which may be due to the physical characteristics of the lakes. There are some limitations of our data set in its current form and how we've historically analyzed it that might kind of limit our current ability to answer some of these questions that we have. Currently, data is pooled at the water body level, and so there may be differences in territory occupancy that we are unable to calculate from the census data in its current form. The number of available and occupied territories will factor heavily into estimates of total carrying capacity, as well as how close we may actually be to that threshold. And as an example on this slide, both of these two lakes are two territory lakes that have one successfully reproducing pair. So we would say that these lakes are equal in terms of occupancy states, but they are not equal in terms of territory saturation, as the lake on the right has two pairs, while the lake on the left only has one. And again, both are two territory lakes, so the one on the left could still accommodate one additional loon pair. And again, territory occupancy is something that will factor heavily into an estimate of carrying capacity, as well as how close we may actually be to it. Another potential limitation is that the occupancy of solo floater adult loons, or loons that don't have a mate or a breeding territory, is not always differentiated from occupancy of territorial pairs. And so we may be missing differences in habitat quality by not differentiating the two. Even if a single loon is present on a water body, that doesn't necessarily mean that that water body is quality loon breeding habitat, because the presence of an individual from a species alone can be a misleading indicator of habitat quality if it's used as such. The best way that we can evaluate habitat quality of a given lake or of a territory for loons is to look at the long-term reproductive success of those lakes and of those territories. Lakes with higher long-term reproductive success may have higher quality habitat than those with low reproductive success and those with no loons present at all. But do we know for sure that vacant territories are inherently poor quality loon breeding territories? Research has shown that loons tend to establish territories, as this flying loon is doing, near other already established loon territories. So maybe vacant territories will be suitable for a loon pair in the future if the population grows and expands its range. The loon in this example just settled and established a territory on a lake that was previously vacant because it's near other lakes with established territories, instead of choosing some of the other open lakes on this landscape, and it may have used what's called social selection to do so. There is also a potential bias in our lake selection towards water bodies with loons present, because volunteer observers are currently free to choose where they want to survey. If observers are selecting for lakes with loons more often, our sample may be biased towards lakes with loons present. So I'll point your attention to the graph on the slide, and specifically the top two trend lines. The x-axis on this graph shows year, and the y-axis shows the number of census lakes. So it seems that as the total number of census lakes goes up or down, which is represented by the blue triangle line, so does the number of lakes with loons present, which is represented by the orange squares line. Meanwhile, the number of lakes with no loons observed, which is represented by the green diamond line at the bottom, doesn't seem to be increasing or decreasing much relative to the other trend lines, and it doesn't seem to follow the number of lakes observed as closely. So there are multiple explanations for this as to why loons observed goes up and down more frequently with the total number of lakes that we have observed. One is that maybe there's just more loons now than there were in 2001, which we definitely think to be true. Anybody who's been in the Adirondack Park for a long period of time knows that there are a lot more loons nowadays than there were decades ago. So regardless of what lakes people select, we will see more lakes with loons over time. But a second possible explanation is that maybe there is this bias in our data and people know where loons are and they preferentially select those areas to survey. So even if we are seeing more loons over time, this could still have an effect on our data. So here's the preliminary results of the occupancy states of the census data since 2001. The x-axis on this graph represents the year, and the y-axis represents the percentage of census water bodies observed per occupancy state. So the top trend line on this graph with the purple squares shows the percentage of lakes with loons observed on them of any age class. So this is all loons pooled into one age class, and it appears that this trend line is going up over time. So we're seeing more loons. But then if you look at the three bottom trend lines on this graph, the blue circle line represents the percentage of lakes with adult loons only seen. That appears to be going up over time, while the orange diamond and black triangle lines, orange diamond representing percentage of lakes observed with offspring, black triangle representing the percentage of lakes observed with no loons on them, both appear to be going down. So it seems that over time we have more loons, but we have more lakes over time that have no offspring. So this is potential evidence for a decline in reproductive success. And the gray dotted trend lines on this graph represent the trend lines if these were linear trends. But something that we really need to investigate is the strength and significance and how representative these trends are of the true rates. Those of you who are more statistically minded, I'm sure there's many of you on this call right now are probably seeing these graphs and wondering what the significance of these trends are, maybe how representative they are. This is something that has not been fully evaluated yet with our data, and it's obviously a very important question to answer and one that needs to be answered if this data will be used for management decisions, estimation of carrying capacity, and other purposes in the future. But these questions and these limitations of our data set are not insurmountable. We have the data in its original form, and we have the technology to help us tackle these questions. One question we would really love to tackle with our data is estimating carrying capacity. And one way that we've hypothesized we could do this estimation with is to run occupancy models, where we would predict where loons in multiple reproductive states may be on the landscape, then randomly select a subset of all lakes in New York that we have no data for, and evaluate how accurate the predictions are of the models that we ran with the loon data that we have. If these predictions were accurate, this would provide us an estimate of the carrying capacity of New York, as well as how close we may be to it. And as Patrick is explaining on the right side of the slide, we have technology like ArcGIS Pro and remote sensing that can generate spatial variables for us without us having to go into the field and collect data at every single lake in New York. And as I've explained, and as is listed on the slide, there are many other questions that we really do need to tackle with these data. You can find more information about the census if you're interested in learning more on the census page of our website, which is linked here. And to bring this all back to the question as to why we do this, as this commenter's profile picture rightly points out, you can't have a bad day at work if you don't go. And this is very true. And in our case, you can't study and conserve a loon population if you don't count them. And for that, we rely on and owe a huge thank you to the hundreds of amazing community scientists who participate in the census each year. So thank you to them, and thank you to you all for joining this talk. There are some amazing photos and figures and these loon graphics provided, so here's credit for those. And with that, I will take any questions. And if you have any additional questions, please email me. My email address is here on the slide. Thank you.
I think there's time for one question if people have it.
Okay.
Oh, actually, there already is one actually in the chat from Pam Michael. She says, maybe I missed it, but what did you do with bodies of water that had multiple observer sets or groups if that happened?
Yeah, so currently the way that historically the census data has always been analyzed since 2001 is we pool data at the water body level. And so we can look at trends over time of occupancy state at the water body level, but that also creates a limitation as well, because then we're not looking at the saturation of territories and changes in occupancy at the territory level. We're only looking at the water body. So right now we pool it, but we have all the raw data, all of the raw survey data, so we can go back and look at the territories themselves. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. And yeah, I think we're ready to move on to the next speaker. We'll let you introduce them, Griffin, if you don't mind.
Yep, let me just get the agenda up. Okay, next speaker is Robert Blackmore, who will be talking about reducing the risk of seabird bycatch in the inshore Newfoundland fisheries.
Perfect.
Looks
Thank you very
good.
much. Yeah, you can see it. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, hello everyone. My name is Robert Blackmore, and I'm a biologist working with the Fisheries and Marine Institute of Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I work on a project in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service researching seabird bycatch in inshore fisheries. I'm part of a team working here at Memorial on this project, led by Bill Montevecchi and Paul Winger. Let's see here. First things first, we work in Newfoundland, Canada, and as many of you are aware of, in a broad context, the Atlantic Canada region and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador is home to an incredible number of seabirds, especially during the breeding season. The inshore waters of Newfoundland and Labrador are very productive, and as such provide critical food sources and a critical staging area for wintering, migrating, and breeding birds. There are many large, globally significant breeding colonies on and around the island of Newfoundland, including 3 of the 6 northern gannet colonies here in North America. They're indicated by these arrows, and they are top to bottom Funk Island, Baccalieu Island, and Cape St. Mary's. I won't get into the breakdown of species composition at these sites, but it's good to note that each colony hosts northern gannets, common murres, and black-legged kittiwakes, which means that as study sites, we can get good insight into diving and surface feeding ecologies in the area surrounding those colonies. And it's also important to note that the 3 colonies also lie in 3 separate NAFO divisions. So these are fishing divisions that each have different fishing practices and regulations, which makes these 3 colonies great study sites from a fisheries management perspective as well. There are many economically important fisheries that take place throughout the year around the island, notably those for shellfish like snow crab and American lobster, but also demersal fishes like Atlantic cod and pelagic fishes like Atlantic herring and Atlantic mackerel. Gill nets are a primary choice of gear for many harvesters, especially in the 2 fisheries that we focus on. So first, there's a fishery for Atlantic herring that occurs solely to provide bait for use in shellfish traps. And that's separate from the commercial herring fishery where seine nets are used to harvest schools of fish. In the bait fishery, surface set gill nets are deployed near shore, and as such, they're prone to bycatch, notably of seabirds like northern gannets that forage on near surface pelagic fish. Another large-scale inshore fishery that takes place here is for commercial cod, in which gill nets are a widespread gear, but some harvesters opt to use long lines as well in that fishery. Both gill nets and long lines are deep set because they target the benthopelagic groundfish, and both gears tend to produce a lot of non-target fish bycatch and some seabird bycatch. So before I move on discussing each of the fisheries individually, I want to make sure that I cover why gill nets are such an issue, just broadly, even if this may be quite a familiar topic for many of you. The gill nets in inshore fisheries here in Newfoundland are stationary, passive gears, and it's important to note that the gill nets aren't baited. Long lines, on the other hand, in the cod fishery, they are baited. Both gill nets and long lines primarily affect diving seabirds, but surface feeding birds can also be entangled or hooked in the gear during the setting or hauling phases of the deployment when the gear is floating at the surface. Quantifying the risk that fishing gears have on marine birds is difficult, but a known and increasingly well-studied issue. And we know that not only is there a temporal element to the risk of bycatch, but there are importantly fine-scale local risk hotspots, and this is especially true for fisheries in the inshore region. This is an example of the spatial element of seabird bycatch in our inshore fisheries. This map shows gillnet locations around the island of Newfoundland, and overlaid with these data are the overall average foraging ranges for gannets and alcids at our 3 colony sites. That's shown as a bubble around the colonies. The pink squares show key capelin spawning sites. As was discussed in the forage fish session earlier today, capelin is a linchpin forage species for predatory fish such as cod, but also for marine mammals and seabirds, and their spawning sites attract a myriad of biodiversity that feed on the capelin and on their spawn. This means that harvesters targeting large schools of Atlantic cod tend to place their gear in the vicinity of capelin deep water spawning sites, which also happens to be where seabirds congregate to feed, equating to high bycatch risk near those spawning sites, right? So with that background information, we'll take a closer look at the fishing parameters that affect bycatch, and I'll first discuss the herring bait fishery. This is a relatively unregulated fishery that harvesters can opt into participating in, so should they so choose, since herring is available for purchase at local fish plants to be used as bait. Setting herring gillnets allows these fishermen to save on the price of bait by catching it themselves, but as such, it's a lot of extra effort. So it's often smaller enterprises that choose to participate. As you can see, diving seabirds are often caught in these nets due to how shallow they're set below the surface. So those nets are at just 6 feet below the surface. And there's a risk of entanglement for surface feeders as well, particularly when the nets are full of catch or if there's a big swell that brings the nets close to the surface. Oh, there's a video here of some gulls pilfering some of the catch as it's being hauled in. So that gives you an example of how surface feeding birds can also become entangled. There's been some previous research from our group investigating gear attachments, such as these high contrast flags that were meant to deter seabirds from foraging underwater near the net. But they actually only really deterred the herring, and thus they were scrapped. And as is the case with any gear, the basic and effective method to reduce bycatch is by reducing the amount of gear or reducing the time that the gear spends soaking in the water column. So we designed a 1-year experiment to qualify how and when catch occurs in herring gillnets and determine if there's a beneficial way to reduce the gear's soak time while maintaining catch. We compared nets that soaked for a standard 24 hours against nets which were hauled after 12 hours soaking during the day, approximately 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., or overnight, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. We studied multiple factors such as bycatch occurrence, catch rate, birds nearby during setting and hauling based on the time of day, and any interactions that we observed from seabirds foraging near the nets during the setting, hauling, and soaking. What we found was that herring catch was maintained in the 12-hour overnight soaks because Atlantic herring is a diurnal migrant that moves higher in the water column overnight. And what that means is that all of the catch in your standard 24-hour soak occurs overnight. And we rarely caught anything at all on our 12-hour day soaks. Total bycatch was also reduced in the 12-hour soaks, and less birds were observed foraging near the vessel during the reduced overnight soaks. Therefore, the best case scenario would be for a paradigm shift in how harvesters use their herring gill nets, only placing them in the evening before dark, and then collecting the catch very early the following morning. However, this bycatch reduction strategy is not an easy adaptation for fishers to implement because this means double the time, double the effort, and fuel needed to achieve that 12-hour soak. On top of this, there's no incentive for the fishers to adopt this practice apart from reducing bycatch, since the herring itself doesn't have much monetary value. With 24-hour soak times, fishers simply need to set the nets in the morning and return the same time the following day to remove the herring catch. Then they simultaneously reset the net in the water for another 24-hour soak, and they repeat. So with this information, we determined that the standard practice, the 24-hour soak, was indeed the next best thing for minimizing bycatch. Therefore, we recommend that all harvesters in this bait herring fishery strategically haul their nets early in the morning, every 24 hours, such that the net doesn't sit in the water full of fish during the daytime foraging period for seabirds and when they're not getting any extra catch, right? And this photo provided here is a gannet that dove into one of our herring nets after it had been hauled and cleaned, but there was a single fish that was missed and therefore visible as prey to gannets flying overhead. Thankfully, we were able to save this individual from drowning, but I believe this highlights the need for surface set gill nets to be emptied of all catch early before the peak foraging period for seabirds. So the Atlantic cod fishery in Newfoundland shares similar issues with bycatch since gill nets are the most common gear choice. However, in this fishery, the risk of bycatch is greater during the setting and to a certain degree the hauling of the gear rather than during the soak. Particularly with long lines, the fact that they're baited at the surface during their deployment means that they're attractive to surface feeding birds. The birds affected in this fishery are surface feeders and shallow divers such as fulmars, as shown in this video, northern gannets, gulls, shearwaters. However, some shearwaters and deep diving species like alcids are at risk during the soak as well. For example, here's a common murre that was caught in the deep set gill nets during a recent study of ours. And what was interesting is that we found there was a degree of self-regulation by most harvesters in this fishery as well, with many people opting to set their baited gear before dawn while it's still dark out, and that way they avoided interactions with most foraging seabirds. So understanding the practices of harvesters and the specifics of how, where, when, and why bycatch occurs, we recommend that harvesters solely set their gear prior to sunrise. That way they avoid interactions with foraging seabirds as much as possible. And this is already being done in some capacity. The remaining issue is that bycatch is still a risk to birds during the soaking of the gear and during the hauling or any additional sets that take place during the daytime. And this is especially true when fishers opt to clean the catch by gutting and trimming the fish on board the vessel prior to resetting their gear. So the next step of this project is attempting to reduce bycatch further in the herring and cod fisheries. And to do so, our current focus is on above water visual deterrence. As mentioned, gear attachments in the past cause reductions in catch rate, but we hope to avoid that with above water deterrents that are designed to deter seabirds from foraging near fishing gear. Similar deterrents have had varied success across the globe. We're currently testing these scary bird kites, which are predator-shaped kites that fly above the vessel and above the deployed gear. So they target the soaking gear as well as the boat while it's deploying it. And here's an example of how we deploy those. We're a year into the facet of this facet of the project, and the scarebird kites have shown some promise so far, but the results are preliminary as of yet. One example is in the herring fishery last spring, where we found that across the 3 NAFO divisions we studied, counts of both surface feeding birds, the gulls, and diving seabirds like gannets were greatly reduced when the kites were deployed, meaning that foraging seabirds were less likely to occur near the fishing gear, and the risk of bycatch was minimized. Similar results came from the inshore cod fishery, though these results are less conclusive, especially with long lines where we think bait might be overriding the effect of the kite to a certain degree. Regardless, the kites do show some promise, and we will continue to investigate their effectiveness as a bycatch reduction technology throughout 2026. So to summarize, our work on this project to date has identified bycatch management strategies that are already being implemented by harvesters, irrespective of enforcement or policy, such as the 24-hour soak in the herringbait fishery, where we found that cleaning the nets of catch early in the morning was the best practice solution to reduce bycatch risk. Similarly, deploying cod long lines before sunrise was effective at reducing seabird interactions. However, these solutions are of the harvester's own volition and they're not monitored in any way, and we have identified that further action can be taken to reduce bycatch risk further through behavioral modifications such as better discard management or time area fishing closures. Lastly, these recommendations do not eliminate the risk of bycatch fully, especially with gill nets during the soak period, and so we will continue investigating above water deterrents that aim to discourage fishing near fishing gear or foraging near fishing gear while not affecting target catch. These modifications need to be simple and applicable for industry uptake long term, so we're going to continue working closely with fishers and connecting with them directly for input throughout the project life and beyond. Thank you, and I'll take any questions if we have time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. And we do have time for a question. If anyone
Yeah, I
has
might have been a
question
bit quick
for
going
Robert.
through that there, but I can
Yeah,
go
no,
back to
that's
anything if you want.
that's totally fine. And there's a little bit of time again at the end if people have more in-depth questions, but we have time for a question right now as well. People have them. Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi there. I'm just wondering if you can give us a sense of how many fishers are sort of taking up the reduction measures or proportion, just your sense of things. I know you don't have anything quantitative. It's really
No,
impressive.
yeah, so we don't necessarily have anything quantitative, but there was a survey done last year by an honor student in our lab where she went around to, I think she ended up getting only about 10 harvesters, but sort of a bunch of fishers that were working out of the 3PS region, so the southern region on the island, just surveying what they think of bycatch risk. Do they see any, and are they taking any action to reduce it? And every one of the fishers, not every single one, but a lot of the fishers that she did survey were saying that they do see bycatch. It's obviously intermittent, it's episodic, but that they are taking these measures to reduce bycatch on their own. And like I said, these are all voluntary measures that we didn't even suggest. We went into the fishery expecting that there was this risk, and we were going to try and mitigate it through some sort of deterrence or some sort of action that we could take. And we found out that these things were already happening. This was practices that through experience these fishers ended up adopting themselves. So there is a bit of, I guess, hope there that working with them further, we can improve upon those reduction strategies.
Great, thank you. Really great talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Robert. I think we're going to move on, but we'll, if there are more questions, you can put them in the chat, and we can come back to them during the question and answer session at the end. So I'll hand it off once again to Griffin.
Yeah, thank you for that great presentation, Robert. Next up, we have Emily Shumchenia. Sorry if I said that incorrectly. And Sarah DeLand. Again, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. Presenting on Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog integration into OBIS-SEAMAP.
Thanks so much, Griffin. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. I'm going to ask Sarah, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, to share. I'm getting a security setting. I'm in a hotel unexpectedly for this presentation. I don't know, Sarah, if you have the slides handy and can share them real quick.
Definitely. Give me 1 second.
Thank you so much. I'll start talking while you're doing that. Thanks, everyone, for your attention to our presentation. I'm tag teaming with Sarah. She and I are going to share this presentation. It's about, and I see that she's got the slide up. Perfect. We're going to talk to you, switching gears, to talk about data management and to talk about the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog. Really excited to bring this to this group because this is the first place that I learned about the Seabird Catalog since I kind of jumped into this part of work 12, 13 years ago. So bringing you this update, we're really pleased to do that today. Next slide. So just a reminder about what RWSE is, who we are, why we're taking this on. I think you all, if you participated in some of the sessions yesterday, heard about RWSE's work. But just as a reminder, it's a joint initiative between the Northeast Regional Ocean Council and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean. Those groups have convened marine life work groups for many years to look at data and make sure that data that represent the footprint of the current resource, whether that's marine mammals or seabirds or fish, is available for people to use and look at and explore on regional data portals. So we maintain the Northeast Ocean Data Portal, the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal, and we'll talk about some of the products related to seabirds there in a minute. But RWSE is a joint initiative of those efforts. And for RWSE specifically, we took on this goal to coordinate research and track data related to marine life and habitat along the entire Atlantic coast, with the goal to support decision-making on the timeframes that decision makers need. So there's a lot of additional resource and background on our website. You see the URL there. You may have heard about, and many of you may participate in our Bird and Bat Subcommittee, which is the group of experts that will talk about and deal specifically with seabird issues. Of course, that's we published a science plan in 2024. We maintain a database of active research related to birds, bats, and other taxa. And we also maintain a research planning map, which is tied into the regional ocean data portals that shows sort of the footprints and the sites of where researchers are collecting data on various topics throughout the region. And then importantly for this talk, we've taken on an examination of data policies, contract language that's included in research contracts or research grant agreements, what repositories are recommended by the different data communities that are associated with different methods or taxa, and what are some of the recommended data management practices. Next slide. So compiling all of that information for birds and bats is the Bird and Bat Subcommittee. And then specifically related to marine bird distributions and at-sea surveys and things like that is this working group that you may have heard about yesterday, the Marine Bird Distribution Working Group, who has an overall goal to sort of collaboratively coordinate research and monitoring efforts to increase our knowledge of marine bird distributions, again, to improve understanding on decision-making related to offshore development. But one specific objective that's relevant to this talk is the objective to aid in the development of data standardization or analytical guidance for survey data so that data are interoperable, reusable, available to anyone who needs them, and easily integrated into products that decision makers use like model outputs, which we'll talk about next. And you can see the QR code to visit the website, read the work plan that has a ton more detail and kind of get a better sense about this working group and how you can plug in. Next slide. So that brings us to the Seabird catalog, which we know has been around since around 2005, so over 20 years. That it's been funded and curated by many different entities over the years that you can see here on the slide, including USGS, BOEM, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, NCOS. The data are used for a lot of things, but the relevant thing we're going to talk about today, because of the link to the portals and to RWSE, is the use to generate the at-sea density estimates of marine birds model outputs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But the Seabird catalog overall has been recognized for this use as really important database, really important collection of data. When we did our assessment of repositories that are out there for different data types, this was an RWSE recommended data resource, but we kind of identified that it's not really a true repository by the definition that our data governance subcommittee established. So to be a true repository, you have to have a public interface to submit data. You have to have a public interface to sort of request data or even see the data in the repository. Things like assigning a DOI to every data set. And there's many other criteria that you'll see on our website. But basically for the Seabird catalog, as many of you know, lately, you needed to know RLIS to be able to submit data. You needed to know RLIS to request data. And unfortunately, we're also aware that there's a bit of a backlog on data sets getting into the catalog. So there's several data sets collected by industry, especially up here in the New England and Mid-Atlantic areas where we know the data are available, but they're not available via the catalog yet because we just don't have the capacity to integrate them. So for that reason, just the need to get data that has been recently collected into the catalog and other more selfish reasons, like RWSE is funding research that relies on the catalog, and you can go to the next slide, we decided to dig a little bit deeper and see what we could solve related to some of these challenges. But before I describe that specifically, just to run you through this existing workflow that we've been observing and sort of helping along that shows the importance of the catalog data. So in the top left corner, you have all of the data from the at-sea surveys that are in the catalog from a variety of sources. So this is one really cool thing about the catalog already is that sources from multiple entities, regardless of where you're funded, you can get your data into the catalog. They're used to develop these species distribution models for 49 species over the last 27 years. It's an incredible amount of data synthesized into these model outputs. And then when NROC, MARCO, and RWSE come in, we convene these expert working groups or subcommittees in the RWSE case to determine, how could we map these models? What are the species groups that matter? What are the combinations of species that we want to look at together? So we've generated maps of all bird species, species of concern, different ecological groups, different spatial groups, different stressor groups. You can learn a lot more about that on the regional data portals. But then finally and importantly, those map products are actually being used in a number of different permit documents and assessment documents. And I've screen capped 3 offshore wind construction and operation plans here to show you that the all bird species abundance layer, and in some cases, a stressor group is being used by offshore wind developers as they're describing their project and describing potential impacts and sort of making the case for the type of monitoring or mitigation or what have you that they will need to do related to their project. So this is a really important workflow that we want to make sure stays intact. And on the next slide, we see what's really needed to make that happen. So we need to continually add new data to the catalog. Of course, we need the catalog to stay relevant, but to do that, we need to maintain the catalog infrastructure itself. So we need funding for it. We need to regularly update the models. There's been 2 updates to the models over time, which is fantastic. But since there's a backlog of data, maybe it's time to think about how we update the models again once we get that backlog addressed. And then we need to continually convene these working groups to review and update species groups based on new data and new research. One of our RWSE funded projects right now is going to be updating a stressor group. It's looking at the vulnerability rankings of seabirds in the Atlantic. We have a layer on the portals that describes seabirds with high vulnerability to offshore wind infrastructure or displacement from offshore wind. And this newly funded research is going to enable us to update that. It's an over 10-year-old assessment. And there may be, I think, Julia Robinson will not probably presented about that at some point in this meeting or will soon. So that finally, that last step is basically, the data that are used in decision making reflect the current information, the current research, and all of the, best available science that we have. So again, this is what it takes to keep this updated, and this is really what we're trying to hone in on and make sure is sustainable for the foreseeable future. So in the next slide, as I was saying, yes, we want to continue that workflow. We want to make sure that our awardees for our RWSE funded research have a catalog that they can access and use to do all those great things. So we coordinated with NOAA NCOS, BOEM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and other experts to talk this through, understand what was needed. There was going to be a need for redundancy no matter what. There's like one copy of the Seabird catalog, or there was until earlier this year, one copy of the Seabird catalog that's really susceptible to either just data corruption or someone gets sick and you can't find the right person to get it. We needed the redundancy. Folks have also over time described the need for easier data submission, easier access to the data, easier ways to use the data, and so on. So we started looking towards integrating the Seabird catalog into OBIS-SEAMAP, which is a platform that's already in existence, and it's run by our friends at the Duke Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, who we've worked with for over a decade on the portals in RWSE, getting these seabird data out there and disseminated in the first place. So they were likely a great partner for this. We were able to leverage existing funds from RWSE, from the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, and the Maine Department of Energy Resources really found this to be a priority for their work with their Offshore Wind Research Consortium. So we were able, as our position as regional coordinators, pull in resources from a bunch of different places to start working on this. And next slide. I think this is my last one before I hand it over to Sarah, but just to introduce you a little bit to OBIS-SEAMAP, if you're not familiar, it came out as a recommended repository in our RWSE repository assessment. And there are many reasons for this, as you can see on the slide. They have data interoperability standards. They assign DOIs to every data set. They have data contribution standards. They're already a global repository with over 9 million records. They publish their data sets to GBIF. You can discover the data sets on the Data One platform as well. And again, like I said, we've worked closely with them for many years. So it seemed like a no-brainer to start thinking about how do we integrate the catalog into a framework that already exists that can really add value. So I think with that, I turn it over to you, Sarah, to really dig into where we are currently with this work.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emily. So I'm just going to do a very quick walkthrough of the Seabird catalog as it currently is on OBIS-SEAMAP. This is a draft format. It's not publicly available, but I just wanted to give you a quick sneak peek of what we've been developing with the funding from RWSE and the consortium of funders that Emily and her team identified. So this is the OBIS-SEAMAP landing page. And if you go to the collaborative contributions at the bottom and hover over that, the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog will come up. And once you click on that, you get to the Seabird Catalog landing page for that subset of data within SEAMAP that represents the Seabird Catalog. So you can see in the map that obviously it's all very concentrated in the Northwest Atlantic. And on the table, you can see that we've currently pulled in about 259 data sets, and they represent species across several taxa and have about 617,000 records associated with these data sets. If you go into a specific data set to look at the metadata that we're populating, this is a data set that was provided to the catalog by Linda Welch. I believe you are on the call, Linda, so thank you for your excellent data set that I could use as an example. But what we've been trying to do is have a kind of a compromise between, some of the metadata in the current Seabird catalog is either missing or incomplete. And so providing some kind of generic Seabird catalog metadata for these data sets to fill that gap. So we have, the primary contact of Linda, but we also have primary contact of the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog, generic user to reach out to OBIS-SEAMAP more directly, A. Fujioka, who is our data analyst who curates the OBIS-SEAMAP and the Seabird Catalog, so that you have a direct line of communication with the catalog curators. We also have kind of a generic abstract to go with the Seabird Catalog. And if you look in the table on the right, a subgroup here, so you could filter data within SEAMAP to just catalog data sets. There's not a DOI assigned yet because, like I mentioned, these are not publicly available, but they will be once these are published. I see Caleb has turned his camera on. I think we're running out of time, but just to say, we're working with the Marine Bird Distribution Working Group to continue working on data standards and required fields, thinking for future data submissions, and just really want to thank the working group for all of the hard work they've done so far and their cooperation going forward in making sure that this the Seabird catalog is as useful to data providers and data users in the future. I'll just leave these next steps up for people to read. We're hopeful that this will be online in the next couple of months, but we're working on getting some survey effort data included and improving that data, including those data standards once we've established them with the working group, and then having working group members look at this draft site, really go through it carefully and provide feedback. So we want to make sure that, like I said, this is reflective of something that's useful to the Seabird community. And I'll have our contact info as well if you're interested in being involved as we continue on in this process, or if you just have any feedback or information you'd like to share. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah and Emily. Sarah, do you mind popping that contact info into the chat when you have a chance?
Definitely.
And stay tuned, because in about 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so, we're going to have a brief Q&A. And if people have any questions, they can hit you up then.
Perfect.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for a great presentation. The last one we have in this section is by Pamela Michael, who will be talking about flight heights and attraction to man-made structures by marine birds in the Gulf of America.
I forgot to turn off my mute, and here's my video, and now we're gonna go presenter view. Is that working out well?
I can see your slides, but we see your presenter view.
Oh, shoot. Okay, well then let's exit and then just do from current slide. All right. Thanks for hanging in there. I'm Pam Michael with Terramar Applied Sciences, and I'm going to tell you about some of our work looking at flight heights and attraction to anthropogenic infrastructure by marine birds in the Gulf of America, which I'll refer to as the Gulf in general. My co-authors include Chris Haney, Yvonne Sattige, Randy Wilson, Jeff Gleason, as well as Patrick Jodis. This is a manuscript in progress, and we look forward to your feedback. For those of you that were at PSG last week, this is gonna look quite similar, but if there are any new ideas cooking or anything that I haven't followed up on, please let me know. This work is the product of multiple funding efforts and multiple projects. Our funders include U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, the Deepwater Horizon, NERDA Trustee Council, BOEM, the USGS, as well as Clemson University for their support, and offered a place for me as a postdoc at the South Carolina Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. The funding from these individuals and support, or these organizations, and support from many individuals has helped to make this work possible. So, for our study context, marine birds are using an increasingly complex marine environment, and infrastructure is going up in many different places around the world. And as Patrick Jodis introduced earlier, the Gulf of America, or Gulf of Mexico, is a very complex region. There's vertical complexity that takes the form of both stationary structures as well as moving structures. So for stationary, I'm talking about things like oil and gas platforms, but moving infrastructure includes things like this, which is shipping or ship data and the movement of vessels. This is AIS data that's vessel tracking, and it's even a conservative characterization of the amount of vessels that are using the Gulf because AIS data isn't required on all ships. Now, the Gulf of Mexico is also used by a really diverse seabird assemblage that includes tropical or subtropical as well as temperate species. And we were interested in learning how different seabirds associate with anthropogenic infrastructures. Oh, where's continue? Sorry. To explore this, we decided to look at the flight height profiles of all the different seabirds that we saw in the Gulf, as well as to assess their association with different anthropogenic infrastructure. To do this, we focused on using vessel survey data, and we used data from a couple of different survey efforts, which are summarized in that table. All of these survey efforts use the same standardized data collection protocol. Data were collected from 2017 to 2024, over 435 days of survey effort. There's some data that we've included that was not collected in the Gulf. And when I describe what we do and how we address each of our aims, I'll go over why we included particular data sets. Starting with our analysis of flight height profiles, we used data from all of the surveys that we had at our disposal. And this is because we wanted to get the largest sample size possible and the most complete profiles for all of the birds that occur in the Gulf. So black-capped petrel do occur in the Gulf, but they're much more commonly seen outside. And we're assuming that flight height behavior and profiles is relatively conserved across regions. And this allowed us to look at a total of 47 different seabird species. Flight height data were obtained by observers using handheld rangefinders and binoculars, and they allocated height into different categories, 7 different flight height categories based on the distance from the surface of the water. So observers accounted for the distance of the vessel height as well as their own height. I want to note that these flight height categories are categorical, and they are also not evenly spaced. But they are standardized across all of our surveys and give us a place to start. For our second analysis, we looked at the association with offshore structures. And for this, we only use data from the Gulf because the composition and distribution of structures outside of the Gulf is very different. And we wanted to look at the rate of attraction, so the percent of individuals that are associated with the structure compared to the individuals that were not associated. We interpreted these data based on behavioral codes that were in the data. So we had 2 codes of interest. One was ship following, and that was generally following the observation vessel. And the other related to was categorized as sitting. And because birds can sit on the water, and we didn't want to say that a bird on the water was associated with a structure, We also looked through the individual comments that observers had the option to include to see whether or not a bird was specifically described as associating with a structure. The structure types we considered were survey vessels, the survey vessel, fishing as well as non-fishing vessels, fixed channel markers, communication platforms, floating and navigational buoys, as well as oil and gas platforms. For our results, we have the distribution of flight height seen across all of our species summarized in this plot here, which I'm hoping you can see my little mouse moving. We have number of individuals on the x-axis, flight height categories on the y-axis, and each species shown in a different color. Black tern were the most commonly observed species, as well as sooty tern were quite common. Sooty tern are light green. We found that the majority of birds flew at or below 25 meters, and I've put a little line on the graph there, which indicates the theoretical rotor swept zone. So this is the area where the below which birds are considered to be below where the turbine blades are likely to be in most offshore platforms, offshore wind turbines. So it's assumed that it looks like the majority of birds are below that level. But we did see some species that didn't fly only at those lower heights. Two examples are magnificent frigate bird and sooty tern. We have plots here with the species labeled and their sample sizes listed on top. That's the total number of individuals. And as you can see, these birds tended to fly relatively low, but also did fly higher, with sooty tern flying over 200 meters, which we've shown on the graph as 300 meters. For our structural associations, we found that 60% of the species we were able to look at, and we were able to look at 45 species, so the ones that had sufficient data in the Gulf. We found that 60% of them had one or more individuals associated with an anthropogenic structure. 8 species had fewer than 10 individuals, so I'm not going to discuss them in relation to the attraction rate, just to be a little conservative on our characterization. But we found that 18 species show no attraction to offshore structures, so not a single bird from 18 species was observed associated with the structure. Low association was found for 8 species, including common tern. Moderate association was seen for 7 species, including magnificent frigate bird, and then a high degree of association, which we drew that threshold at 30%, included roseate tern, mass booby, brown booby, who we have pictured here on the observation vessel, as well as red-footed boobies, where 89% of individuals observed showed an association with one of the structures that we looked at, or that we included in our characterization of anthropogenic structures. In summary, the majority of birds that we observed were seen flying at 25 meters or less, but there are many species that do fly higher and across a range of heights that we evaluated. We also note that observations occurred during relatively calm conditions, so it's likely that profiles could shift slightly if observations or more information was obtained from more extreme or intense conditions. Not surprisingly, attraction differs by species. And we found from 0 to 83% of individuals to 89% of individuals associated with structures for the species that had 10 or more individuals observed. We consider this to be a conservative estimate because it relied on the observer actually annotating their observations and noting what structure they were sitting on if birds were noted as sitting on the water. We also saw some structure hopping, so that's birds moving from one structure to another, which was quite often from another vessel to following the observation vessel. We want to offer this as vessel-based observations, being another way to contribute insights into flight height and attraction, which can be used to inform the potential that we think each species has to interact with infrastructure. And we're also looking at patterns in abundance with distance from the observation vessel. And feel free to ask me about that now or later, as that's also on the way. Thank you, and let me know if you have questions. I'll stop sharing, or should I keep sharing? I'm done with the formal presentation.
Thanks so much, Pam. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you can probably stop. We're going to go into the question and answer session. I'm going to let Griffin lead that, but great presentation, and I know there's going to be a number of questions right now, so I'll let Griffin handle those.
Yeah, great talk, Pam. Thank you again. First question is from Jeffrey Spendelow. I was struck by the difference in rate of association of common terns versus closely related roseate terns. Any thoughts as to why?
You're muted
Pam, I
right
think
now,
your
Pam.
mic is muted.
At the moment, no, I haven't dug into common tern. I remember you asked me about roseate tern, and they were generally associated with floating buoys as an object. I guess I'm not sure why. Common terns, I think we had a smaller sample size with them as well. That could impact it, but I can think about that more and get back to you. Feel free to shoot me an email if you want a little bit more detail.
All right, next question is from Kate Williams. The association of roseate terns with structures is interesting. Do you think they are really more attracted to structures than other terns, or are they easier to identify at a species level if they are stationary and sitting on structures?
I don't know if the challenge in differentiating the species would really would be impacting the assessment so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that some terns are harder to differentiate from others, but also there are relatively fewer roseate tern. I'd have to think a bit more about that one and also look at the rates per species, because I got to be honest that I don't remember everything for all 40 some species. But I can get back to you if you want to shoot an email for more follow-up. I apologize.
Got lots of questions for you, Pam. This one's next from Holly Goyert. That's
Oh,
great,
yeah.
Pam. Could you please describe perhaps the protocol from observers for defining an association with infrastructure? Distance-based, behavior-based?
Yeah, so it is kind of an inferred association based on their characterizing the behavior of the bird as one of a set of behavioral codes. So there were two behavioral codes that we considered as potentially indicating an association. One of those was ship following, which was supposed to indicate following the observation vessel, and the other one was just sitting. And so I looked at comments to get at that. And the majority of these birds were within 300 meters. Occasionally, there were some that fell outside of that, where Gulf conditions allowed, or the conditions allowed observers to confidently identify them and characterize it. But it's, we're really exploring standardized data exploring the behavioral data plus comments to try to infer association through that combo. But it wasn't a new thing. It's trying to make use of what's out there.
All right, next question is from Caleb. What was the sample size of roseate tern flight height observations?
Rolling through the paper.
It could be an estimate too. I just am curious.
Yeah, it's 24.
Okay.
All right, a little bit of a break. This next one is for Robert Blackmore. Comes from Sarah Geithart. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Excellent talk. I noticed in your final picture the scary bird deterrent is close to land. Do you know if there are risks of disturbance at the colony from the scary birds?
Yeah, a great question. So in that photo, that is pretty much the exception to the rule. That's the one site where we are working with fishermen where they're very, very close to shore, placing their nets. Most of the nets in the fleets that we work with are, hundreds of meters to even kilometers from shore, usually still within sight of land, but none of them are near the colony per se. So that site is very close to a harbor, but there's not a seabird colony breeding colony there. However, that is something we've had to take into account because along the coast in that area there are both roosting immatures and we believe some nesting gulls and black guillemots. And this was something that we had to consider was like the disturbance of putting up the scary bird deterrent, especially when we were leaving it up for long periods of time during those 24-hour soaks. And at first we thought there might have been disturbance, but it turns out we actually ran into the opposite problem where, anecdotally anyway, we believe that they were sort of becoming accustomed to the presence of the kite and kind of ignoring it. Even when real bald eagles would fly over, everything would flush. But when we would put up the scary bird kite, after a few weeks of running these trials, yeah, they sort of acclimatized to it. So it's almost the opposite problem. But no, there's no disturbance at the colony. We're too far from the colony at any of our sites for like the gannets, murres, those kind of things.
Very interesting. Pam, we are back to you. 2 questions from Evan Adams. First is, how worried are you about ground bias from the vessel surveys? Birds are easier to see when they are closer to the surface.
Yeah, I was working on writing a response to that one. So observers did the best with essentially they had a stick with distances marked with heights marked on it, similar to the way that observers categorize distance between 0 to 100 meters, 100 to 200, 200 to 300, and beyond. So they use that same approach. And where all of our observers were quite experienced, and these categories are also used elsewhere in the height categories. So they did their best, but it was human measured and not laser measured. And it'd be super cool to be able to do paired observations so we could get a better sense of how accurate that is, but also thinking about what the error rates on human and different tools really mean in terms of the questions we're asking about possible exposure to offshore wind turbines. And the second one mentioned distance correction to calculate for abundance. So I want to clarify that it wasn't a distance correction to calculate for abundance. We're looking at the patterns in abundance with distance from the vessel, and we're finding a lot of classical distance sampling assumptions being violated, that some birds are much more frequently observed close to the vessel, whereas others are much more frequently observed farther from the vessel. There appears to be attraction and avoidance happening within that 300-meter strip width. And so that's something that we've seen a lot of in our data and are trying to think about how that will impact the non-random distribution of how that non-random distribution will impact our interpretation of number of birds, relative density, number of individuals.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about. Sounds like a mess. Interesting.
Active cogitation and invitations to cogitate, wish we could have beverages and snacks.
We should talk. This comes up with a lot of offshore structures. I don't think there's great solutions for it right now. I wonder if we could think of some. Anyway, interesting.
Love to hash it out sometime.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
All right. Probably have time for one last question, Caleb. Feel free
Yeah, I
to
think so.
interject if
Yep.
you
And then
want to
we
jump
can
to the
stay on
next one.
schedule. Yep.
Okay. Last question is for Robert again. Would you please mention the recent and anticipated increase in the Newfoundland cod fleet? What do you think the likelihood would be that scary bird kites, if they continue to show promise, would be adopted at a larger scale?
Sure. So for the first half of that question, yeah, so there is an anticipated increase in cod fishing activity in northern parts. So when I showed that map of the NAFO divisions, they're very different. The 3K and 3L, which are sort of on the northeast side of the island, cod stocks are doing well. There's actually, growth and anticipated, and like Caleb said, an increase in cod fishing activity in the future if the stocks continue to improve. In the south, it's actually the opposite. Those cod stocks are dying, and it's probably a mixture of climate change and things like that. But I won't get into that. But so in those regions where it is anticipated to grow, what do I think that the likelihood would be that these could be implemented? The good thing is that the kites are easy to use, easy to implement. However, we have had a lot of issues with just sort of the practical side of reinforcing the kites, putting kites out for long term on the ocean. I mean, they don't fare well in the winds and the saltwater spray, right? So we've had to reinforce them a lot. And recently, actually, we've worked with a pest control company who uses this brand of kites to see what it is they do to keep them up on roofs of buildings for months at a time. And that was extremely helpful. We gained a lot of insight there. So there are modifications that need to be made. You can't necessarily use the kites out of the box, but if they do continue to show promise, sure, it's always going to be an uphill battle to convince every last harvester that these are, good for them to use. But at least with the fishermen that we work with, there's a very much a sense of wanting to decrease bycatch, not just from, I guess, like a holistic point of view, but I mean, it's a nuisance to them to deal with bycatch. So I think a lot of the people that we've talked to, if they were to work and they were easy to implement, they would happily adopt them. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all the speakers in this session. We're going to move on in the interest of time. And the first, I'm going to hand it off to Stephanie Avery-Gomm from Environment Climate Change Canada, and she's going to be talking about the cumulative effects of pressure from offshore wind energy development and other sources on Gannets. So take it away, Stephanie. She's also going to lead the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm presenting today on behalf of a number of co-authors, some of whom are here today, but especially want to acknowledge Megan Ferguson from the Biodiversity Research Institute, who's a co-PI on this work. All right. So Eastern Canada has world-class offshore wind resources, and Nova Scotia is moving forward quite quickly to develop them. And offshore wind development has obviously environmental implications that need to be considered and are best considered early in the planning process. For aerofauna such as migratory birds and bats, offshore wind farms can act as barriers to movement, displacing individuals from preferred habitat or migration routes. And individuals who do not avoid turbines are at risk of collision, depending on flight height, as we just saw. Offshore wind farms may also alter prey availability and increase associated pressures such as vessel traffic and artificial light, as well as disturbance during construction and decommissioning. And importantly, offshore wind developments do not occur in isolation. Aerofauna are already exposed to multiple pressures. Seabirds, we know, may be affected by fisheries bycatch, marine vessel traffic, oil pollution, marine debris, disease, and climate change. And these pressures accumulate over space and time. And estimating how pressures accumulate and using that information to inform decisions that avoid or manage those effects is the purpose of a cumulative effects assessment. And regional scale cumulative effects assessments are most valuable during the early planning phase when siting decisions are still on the table. Many mitigation measures for birds and bats remain untested in offshore environments, which makes where we put turbines our strongest lever for avoiding harm. And a regional approach can identify where in the offshore farms are least likely to compound existing pressures, allowing conservation obligations to be better considered alongside economic and clean energy objectives. Last year, colleagues and I from BRI and elsewhere published a framework to guide regional cumulative effects assessments. I'm going to call them CEAs. It's much faster and easier for offshore wind. And this work was developed to support the regional assessments of offshore wind that were underway at the time in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. The framework provides a step-by-step guidance for conducting assessments using a species-based analytical strategy, and a central feature is the cumulative effects metric, which combines varied types of species and pressure data into a single quantitative estimate. And the framework is intentionally adaptable to different regions, species, and most importantly, data contexts. So since publishing this framework early last year, we've turned our attention to demonstrating it through a case study. Before I dive in, I want to really clarify that at this stage, we are still working on this demonstration, and the results that we generate will not be intended to inform licensing decisions. Once the proof of concept is complete, further work is going to be needed before it can be operationalized, and that work is not funded at this point. With this case study, we are aiming to demonstrate three things about the framework. First, the flexibility in the species data requirement, and we'll do this by running the whole CEA on two different types of information about species distribution. Second, the ability to integrate multiple pressures represented by different types of data within a single species-based assessment. And then the third aim is to demonstrate the application of the framework, specifically how it can be used to evaluate and compare the cumulative effects of alternative wind farm arrangements under plausible future development scenarios. We selected northern gannets as our focal species following a workshop with seabird experts in early 2024. We did not choose them because they are the best seabird species. We chose them because they are management relevant, vulnerable to offshore wind, and have a lot of data, which is what makes them well suited for demonstrating the framework's flexibility. And I can't see the chat right now. Okay, so let's talk about species data. So for our low information species distribution data, we are using uncorrected counts of northern gannet sightings from Environment Canada's Seabirds at Sea program. And for our high information data, we're using absolute density estimates from preliminary density surface models fitted to the same underlying count data. The DSMs account for survey effort and detection and predict densities in unsurveyed times and areas. And as I said, we'll run the entire CA analysis on both types of species data so we can explore how results differ. And I do also want to note that the DSM is preliminary because ECCC will be conducting surveys within 3 of the wind energy areas over the next 6 months. And that data will be used to improve the DSM products this fall, but that information is not available for the time of this study. And so we're moving ahead with the preliminary products as best available. The second aim of our project is to demonstrate the flexibility to accommodate multiple types of pressure represented by different information types. And that aim is sort of addressed by default because of the data that we have is in different forms. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I just want to show you that we've built a detailed conceptual model of offshore wind and other pressures on northern gannets. And this was informed by expert input and the literature. And the visual here shows which pressures we've included. All of the ones that are gray, we have excluded. The others are included. Their proximate effects and ultimate impacts on individuals. And so I've said that for this case study, we've excluded pathways shown in gray, and those are where data were insufficient or better suited to other approaches, such as aspatial population viability analyses. So next, I'm going to walk you through how we've applied the framework to compare cumulative effects between alternative wind farm arrangements under plausible future development scenarios. The future development scenarios piece is important because turbine technology, spacing, and total build-out define how much area a wind farm occupies, and there's uncertainty in the economic, regulatory, and technological factors that will shape the offshore wind in the region. We're going to run 18 scenarios in total for each of our wind farm arrangements. That'll cover both the high and low information species data and all the combinations of turbine technology, distance between turbines, and total build-out. For our timeline, for the case study, we're assuming full build-up by 2040, that all wind farms just pop into existence at the exact same time, and our predictions will extend to 2075, which is roughly 2 gannet generations. The polygons here show the delineation of 7, need to update my slide notes, 7 wind energy areas, and these were informed by the regional assessment of offshore wind, which I mentioned, and subsequent government decisions. The darker the polygons with darker lines are those that there's a call for bid anticipated for these areas in the near future. Okay, so now you might ask, how did you come up with alternative wind farm arrangements so that you had something to compare? That's a good question. So first, we defined an optimal wind farm arrangement for northern gannets as one that optimized collision risk, and that required spatially explicit estimates of annual collision risk. For high information data, for our high information species data, we ran a stochastic collision risk model for every 10 kilometer squared cell in our study area using local wind data and our northern gannet density estimates from the DSM for each season and then summed across seasons to get an annual collision estimate per cell. And this was done for each combination of turbine tech and spacing, as these influence the CRM results. And avoidance behavior is already factored into these estimates. For the low information species data, we skip the collision risk model entirely and use relative gannet abundance as a proxy for collision risk. And so the goal is then to minimize the total abundance summed across seasons rather than the predicted collisions. So we then use linear integer programming to select a combination of cells that minimizes either the predicted mortality or the relative abundance, depending on the species data. And this identifies the mathematically optimal arrangement given the scenario parameters and our assumptions. And one of our assumptions is that a minimum viable wind farm size would be 0.4 gigawatts based on discussions with industry and the province. For this demonstration, we've solved a relatively simple problem, but with more time and resources, this could be refined to be more realistic and complex. For comparison, we also created an alternative arrangement meant to approximate what a developer-driven layout might look like, allocating capacity across wind energy areas following recent policy guidance that has been sent to the Canadian Offshore Energy Regulator, and then selecting cells in a cluster until the build-out target was reached. And I will also mention that in the design of this, and also for our optimal wind farm arrangement, we've further constrained the boundaries of those polygons to areas that are more likely to be developed based on depth and geology following guidance from Natural Resource Canada. Okay, so we've estimates of collision mortality for each wind farm arrangement. Now that we have those, we have to account for how birds respond behaviorally. Based on Pavat et al., we assume that 83% of gannets that would have otherwise occupied a cell will be displaced, and to account for how that might increase densities outside of a given wind farm energy area, or wind farm arrangement rather, we redistribute those birds to neighboring cells based on habitat quality and distance, and then this influences the estimated cumulative effects calculations for the remaining pressures. So next we integrate our pressure data for non-offshore wind energy pressures. That includes oil and light pollution, marine vessel traffic, oil and gas platforms, and fisheries bycatch. And right now we're using landings as a proxy for fisheries bycatch. Not ideal, but it's what we've got to work with now. And to account for the fact that northern gannets are not equally sensitive to all the pressures, we've conducted an analytical hierarchical process survey with 43 northern gannet experts from Europe and North America to develop weightings, and those weightings are then used in the cumulative effects calculation. We've this method that we've used has been entirely adopted from David Liskey's et al.'s paper in biological conservation from a few years back. Okay, so now for each pressure, we select a cumulative effects metric that matches the species data we have and apply the expert-derived sensitivity weightings with the type of pressure data that we have. So we've got our species information, our pressure information, we choose our cumulative effects metric, and the resulting CE values are then summed across pressures to give a single cumulative effects score per grid cell for each pressure for each wind farm arrangement. So here's sort of what that looks like. So here we're showing the scaled and expert-listed weighted CE total value for a selection of pressures, but this is again for a very specific future development scenario and wind farm arrangement. And then this, so in this picture, what I'm showing is the optimal wind farm arrangement, preliminary results here, optimal wind farm arrangement based on the high information species data, assuming 15 megawatt turbines, 8D spacing, and a 2.5 gigawatt build out. We are going to have a lot of maps when we're done. To compute the cumulative effects metric, the total cumulative effects metric for each cell, we take the weighted CE metric for each pressure, then sum the resulting values into a single cumulative effects score. And to arrive at the CE score for a given wind farm arrangement, all of the cells in the boundary of the wind farm arrangement are summed. So here I'm showing how the CE score can be used to compare among wind farm arrangements. The CE metric of this optimal or collision minimizing wind farm arrangement can serve as a benchmark for comparing other proposed arrangements under the same development scenario. But when comparing CE scores across alternatives, remember that the total score combines multiple pressures that are scaled and weighted, and small differences in the total CE score can mask large differences in specific pressures. For example, in this case, we've got our total CE score for the optimal being 128 and the alternatives being very close to that. But the estimated number of collisions is roughly 2.5 for the optimal arrangement. Thanks for that. And 10 times higher in the alternatives. And so this shows that even when the CE scores are similar, individual pressures like collision mortality can differ substantially. Our demonstration will do what it aims to, but there are several areas for improvement that would be good to tackle before considering it operational. One that I'm particularly keen to dig into is improving the pressure data. For example, how can we alter fisheries, marine vessel traffic, and light pollution layers to reflect the changes that would result from the placement of a wind farm? I'm assuming that we would turn down the volume on fisheries and turn up the volume on vessel traffic and light pollution. I'm also keen to model the population viability impact, population level impacts using a population viability analysis. This is something that we aim to do, but ultimately decided to circle back to due to time. But despite these simplifications, regional cumulative effects assessments can clearly provide a structured way to weigh multiple pressures and identify lower risk areas early in planning. And for species with limited mitigation options, avoidance by designing or avoiding impacts by designing wind farms to minimize them is the most effective strategy. And our Northern Gannet case study will demonstrate that the framework handles multiple data types, integrates diverse pressures, and allows transparent comparison of alternative siting options. So at this point is a proof of concept, but it's one that we're eager to build on. So I think that I have probably used up all of my time. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat or get in touch with Megan and I via email. And now I am going to invite Greg to put his presentation up. I will stop sharing. And we will turn our attention to Greg, whose talk is titled Big Brother is Watching You Using Automatic Multi-Sensor Arrays to Monitor Seabirds on Offshore Installations.
All right,
Perfect.
great.
That looks great.
It looks good? Okay. All right, perfect. Thank you. And thank you for that introduction as well. Today, I want to talk to you about some of the multi-sensor automated arrays that we've been using to monitor birds at offshore installations. And in addition, I'll be showing some data on how results from remote sensing equipment compare to a human seabird observer stationed on the platform at the same time. So currently, a human seabird observer is the most widely used method for documenting birds offshore, often through boat-based surveys or aerial visual surveys. So the good thing about this approach or this method is that it's well established, it's somewhat standardized in the methodology they use to collect the data. It's been accepted by agencies. You can often get opportunistic or incidental observations using this approach. The results are relatively quick. Data are transcribed to either electronic or paper medium, and it can be analyzed in a spreadsheet or a software program like R. And it's relatively simple, just a person, binoculars, collecting data. However, the downside to this approach are several. We have observer fatigue, the effectiveness or the efficiency of observers declines as fatigue sets in. Uncertain identifications, depending on the distance and environmental conditions, can weigh in. There are no raw data hard copies other than what's on the data sheets, but actually a record of what was actually seen in the field doesn't really exist. They're costly through both logistical and financial obligations. They're also weather and visibility dependent. So as visibility decreases, ability for the human observer to detect targets also decreases. In addition, depending on the vessel or the proximity of an observer to the intended targets or the birds, they can actually influence the behavior. And then if there are multiple observers conducting or working on the same study, there can be differences in observer, which can introduce biases into the results. So these sensors can remote sensing can replace humans in some cases and detect targets at night in all weather conditions, thus kind of addressing many of the limitations that I mentioned in the previous slide. So, the particular remote sensing equipment that we're working with is called ATOM. It stands for Acoustic and Thermographic Offshore Monitoring. So the acoustics, we have acoustics for birds and bats, thermal and IR videography, ambient light HD videography, and Morus receivers and associated antennas with that receiver. And this, depending on the study design and project goals, this is a modular design and can be adapted. You can increase or decrease particular components depending on the goals of the study. There are also system redundancies built in the form of multiple thermal cameras and also multiple bird and bat acoustic detectors, and also backup of the data storage from the cameras on site. And all data are saved to either SSD cards, SD cards or SSD solid state drives. So this combination of these sensors have evolved over multiple projects and multiple different platforms, and depending on the study design and goals. And I'm going to talk about 3 different studies where we've used this particular technology. So this first one is going to be from some results from the first offshore North Carolina study at Frying Pan Shoals Light Tower. So we were tasked with looking at patterns of biological activity in the offshore environment. This particular video is a non-vocalizing frigate bird. And usually we try to match calls with thermographic imagery when possible, but we weren't able to in this case. However, in the case of the frigate bird, it has such a distinctive silhouette that you can actually identify species with thermal data, which is not normally the case. So for this initial deployment, we had just had thermal video cameras and acoustics off the coast of North Carolina. So we recorded species year round. Most of these were hanging out on the light tower, as confirmed from some visual confirmations. Most of these were gulls and terns, both vocalizing and recording in the thermographic data. And most of the activity occurred between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. So in the acoustic data for this project, looking at species, we had 2,640 songbird calls across 33 species, and this represents 3 different migratory strategies: Caribbean migration, East Andes, and within the U.S. Migration. And most of these observations occurred in April and October. We noticed significant activity migratory activity when they had tailwinds at less than 10 kilometers per hour or 3 meters per second. And we also observed a notable increase in flight height of about 2-fold from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. compared to other times during the day. So this also highlighted the possibility of encountering species that don't need to cross water, but do so to reduce distance and energetic costs. And this particular finding holds true across all of our studies, including the 3 that we talk about here, particularly for thrushes and warbler species. However, one of the lessons learned from this particular study was the need for acoustics and integrated visible light cameras so that we can identify those non-calling birds. We did have a lot of unidentified observations that were recorded only in thermal, but not in acoustic. So that was one limitation that we hope to address in the future, which we were able to do. So the second study is the project to mention is the Dominion Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project. This is 44 kilometers offshore of Virginia. And by the time this project started, we had added an ambient light camera to address the shortcomings used in the previous study. So in this study, we're using 2 thermal cameras, 1 ambient light camera, 2 bird and 2 bat acoustics, and a Morus receiver. And we were able to, given the small working environment on the turbine platform, we were able to reduce the system's size despite employing more sensors than we did in the previous study. And all of these sensors were powered directly by the turbines themselves. So we tested which each sensor contributed to bird and bat characterization and overall knowledge of the study to understand the importance of having multiple sensors. So in the first deployment, we were relying on the acoustics to give the species-specific ID, and because not all vocalize or don't vocalize close enough to a sensor, we had a lot of those unidentified. So in this particular study, for the species identifications that we were able to ascribe to species, 60% of those came from the visible light cameras, and this provided an additional 25 species that were not recorded in acoustics or the Morus system, including northern flicker, Mississippi kite, and brown creeper. Then for the acoustics, which provided about 40% of the species-specific detections, this provided an additional 10 species not in the visible light or the Morus, including common loon and some shorebirds. And then finally, the Morus receivers gave us less than 1% of the detections for species-specific identifications, but they did provide an additional 10 species not detected by the other sensors, including red knot, piping plover, and some other shorebirds. So adding these additional sensors contributed significantly to the species-specific identifications in the study. And then finally, for the third project, here we're directly comparing the use of cameras with a traditional bird observer. So unlike the previous two studies, this study was done on an offshore oil and gas drilling rig, and the Seabird observer was collecting data during the same period of time that the sensors were operating. So this particular site was about 450 kilometers offshore of Newfoundland in Labrador, Canada. We had 2 thermographic cameras, 2 ambient light cameras, bird acoustics, and Morus for this study. So we had a surprising amount of species richness. Being that far offshore, we had 38 species from 5 species groups in the 3 months that it was deployed in the fall. Fulmars, shearwater, and great black-backed gull were the most common. We had 3 shorebird species, American golden plover, ruddy turnstone, and pectoral sandpiper. There were also 15 passerine species, including some of the ones from the previous study, bobolink, dark-eyed junco, and some others. And we also had some unexpected observations, brown booby and especially red-footed booby that we saw, which was unexpected. And this particular video showing the observations from the visible light camera for the brown booby out there. So now, comparing the remote sensing equipment to the Seabird observer, we had, if we look at the number of days where birds were observed out during the study, so Adam, we had 95% of the days with birds observed, whereas only 61% of the days had birds observed with the Seabird observer. With Adam, we identified 38 species, and the Seabird observer, we identified only 11 species. And Adam also did better relatively with a number of observations at night, although the Seabird observer did not collect data at night. So 20% of the observations, 20% of the total observations were at night, and we're seeing with Adam. And then also observations during inclement weather days was also better, with 84% of inclement weather days detecting birds with Adam and only 53% with the Seabird observer. So with the remote sensing equipment, we got a lot more species than the Seabird observer. We had a lot, especially with those boobies, which were quite a bit further north than we thought previously. And we're also seeing a lot of birds even with the location so far offshore. We're getting both latitudinal and longitudinal migrants, with a few examples shown on the slide here. So thank you very much to our clients of sources of funding, BOEM, Dominion Energy, and Equinor for allowing us to do the research for this particular project. And the three pictures here at the bottom of the slide are the moment your ultrasonic microphones go offline out at the wind turbines. And then the QR code on the right is a link to the publication of the first year of results from the Dominion project that I talked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to go directly on to the next speaker. But if anyone has questions, you can either hold them to the Q&A or just put them in the chat. That was a great talk. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Michaela, I believe. Please correct me if it's wrong. Hi. A quantitative assessment of risks to seabirds and migratory landbirds from energy development in the Gulf. Please take it away.
Hi everyone, I'll share my screen here.
It's just loading.
Okay, can you all see that now?
Yeah, I think you want to enter presenter view.
How is that?
Looks great. Excellent.
Okay. And if I show presenter view here, are you still seeing the main slide?
We're just seeing your slides. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Just what you want us to.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Michaela Peterson from Biodiversity Research Institute, and I'm going to be talking about a quantitative assessment we did for risk to seabirds and land birds from energy development in the Gulf of Mexico. And just before I start, to quickly address that there's been a lot of changes in offshore wind policy in the U.S., and that this project did focus on wind energy areas in the Gulf of Mexico, which were rescinded last year, unfortunately. So this analysis is now more of an example of how this approach works and how it can be applied to future sites for energy development. So the Gulf of Mexico is a very important region for birds, with billions of migratory birds passing over each year. And it's also home to a large number of seabirds, including species such as the endangered black-capped petrel and the previously listed brown pelican, which has made a strong comeback in the Gulf. However, it's also a hotspot for energy development, which can carry risks for birds. And risk to birds from offshore energy development can range from direct mortality due to collisions to altered energetics due to changes in movement patterns as a result of either attraction to or avoidance of development, which can have cascading effects on individual fitness and population dynamics. Our objectives for this project were 1, to quantitatively map risk for seabirds across the Gulf, 2, assign categorical risk scores to specific wind development areas, and 3, to assess how the spatial scale of analysis impacts results when conducting this type of analysis. And we used data for our seabird analysis from the GoMaps project, both boat survey data, which was used by Pamela Michael and colleagues to develop MaxEnt models, which we used to assess risk for 24 species, and the GoMaps aerial survey data, which was used by Kayla Davis to develop abundance models for brown pelican and northern gannet, encompassing nearshore areas, which we used to evaluate the effects of scale on our analysis. So we're conceiving of risk here as being comprised of 3 components: conditions and stimuli, which are the project-specific factors, such as the rotor swept zone of wind turbines; exposure, which is the spatiotemporal distribution of birds that determines how likely they are to actually encounter development in a given area; and vulnerability, which is species-specific factors. To assign risk scores to specific wind development areas, we took our exposure rasters those MaxEnt models or abundance models from the GOMAPS data. We aggregated those normalized exposure rasters to the size of each development area, calculated the quantiles of all cell values in the aggregated raster, and then determined which quantile the mean value for the development area fell into. So you can see an example of that in this figure, which is showing an exposure raster for northern gannet, aggregated to the size of that lease area outlined in red, and then the quantile values for that map, showing that the lease area mean falls into the lowest quantile, so we would give it an exposure risk score of 1, a minimal risk. We also used a similar approach to create risk maps at varying extents, for which each raster cell was assigned the quantile it fell into relative to the entire extent of the normalized raster. So giving a categorical risk in each grid cell of 1 through 4. We also incorporated species vulnerability traits from an analysis conducted by Normando into an overall risk metric, accounting for population vulnerability, displacement vulnerability, and collision vulnerability. And then we multiplied these vulnerability metrics by exposure risk. Overall, looking at risk to seabirds in federal waters, we found that risk was generally higher in the central and eastern planning areas in the Gulf, near the borders of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And while exposure risk was greatest at intermediate depths, as you see in the top figure there, considering other types of vulnerability shifted risk near shore, as you see in the bottom figure, as well as westward somewhat. And the attributes of species found in greater densities near shore, such as flight height for gulls leading to greater collision risk, and high collision risk and population vulnerability risk for a number of tern species, led to that greater risk in closer to near shore when vulnerability was considered, as well as just exposure risk. And now here are risk score results for specific wind development areas for seabirds. And you can see in the second to last row here that averaged exposure risk across all species is low in all areas, but there is a great deal of variability among species, as you can see in the rest of the table. And that while all areas have a score of 1 for exposure average across all species, scores are higher for total risk due to species with higher vulnerability having some higher risk, higher exposure in those areas. And the most at-risk areas are that lease area and wind energy area option N, which are the easternmost of the areas considered. As you can see in the inset map, they're the only ones located in the central rather than the western planning area in the Gulf. So we also, as I mentioned, wanted to look at the scale of analysis and how that impacted our results. So looking at it as an example for northern gannets, we had data across federal and state waters. So we compared looking at exposure risk just considering federal waters versus considering federal and state. And you see that because generally there was higher maximum density in state waters, when you're looking at that bottom map, which includes state waters, you see generally lower risk categories further offshore in the federal waters. So that rather than if you're only considering federal waters, you see those risk scores moving further offshore. So you see that the lease areas would fall into higher risk areas than if you're considering the state waters as well. And looking at how those different analysis extents impact risk scores for individual wind energy areas, for gannets and for brown pelicans. We see that in general, the risk scores in federal waters decrease when risk is assessed relative to the full Gulf rather than federal waters only. And for lease areas in Louisiana state waters, to the right of each of those figures, the differences in risk scores were a little less consistent. And for brown pelican, depended on the season rather than the extent of the analysis. So then we also had a somewhat more qualitative analysis for risk for land birds. We assessed exposure to land birds in the 3 BOEM planning areas by compiling evidence for species presence in each area from a variety of data sets, including incidental observations from GOMAPS and eBird pelagic surveys, and from literature sources. And this table here is showing the number of species in each corridor based on different levels of evidence. For one major source, the western and central areas were lumped together as one migration corridor, so we included that combination as a separate category. And you can see that the western area has the greatest number of species overall, or that western and central planning area combined when you include that. To combine this broad scale exposure analysis with vulnerability scores, we averaged the vulnerability scores, which ranged from 0 to 10, of all species with direct evidence of being present in an area. And the results here show that average vulnerability scores and overall risk generally get higher moving from east to west. So just to go over our overall results again, we see that the risk to seabirds are most concentrated in the central and eastern planning areas in the Gulf, and that considering vulnerability as well shifts that risk westward and inland. And we found that those results were driven by high vulnerability of terns and brown pelicans in nearshore waters adjacent to the Louisiana coastline in the central planning region. We found that risk to land birds is highest in the western and central Gulf, but that was a very broad scale analysis, and finer scale distribution data is definitely needed to draw stronger conclusions. Looking at specific areas that had been considered for wind energy development, we see that most are relatively low risk for seabirds, which is great. Although unfortunately the one lease area that is already leased did have somewhat higher risk scores. And then also I just want to note that the results from this analysis for exposure risk and population risk, though not of course collision or displacement vulnerability, are equally applicable to oil and gas development, which is of major concern in the Gulf as well. And then again, I want to note how the scale of analysis really does influence the results in this case, so that if managers are going to be taking this type of analysis and deciding which risk scores to use, you really want to consider whether you're asking where in the entire Gulf should energy development be sited to avoid or minimize risk to seabirds, versus like where in a specific jurisdiction like federal waters or state waters or a certain planning area would seabirds be most at risk. And when planning out areas for future development where leases are going to be accepted, a jurisdictional scale approach likely makes the most sense as a conservative approach to minimize risk most effectively. And then when evaluating specific projects, it may make more sense to consider the greater context of the entire region. So for example, maybe Gannets, if you are only considering federal waters, are high risk in that lease area. But then if you're considering state waters too and see that Gannets are much more abundant in the state waters, you realize that they're not maybe actually that it's not as much of a concern. And overall, a multi-scale approach considering risk at those different scales can provide a holistic understanding of overall risk. I want to thank all my co-authors on this project and also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for funding it, and thank all the GoMaps contributors whose data was invaluable in this work. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm applauding over here, but my microphone was off. We have 1 minute before we need to switch to the next speaker. So I guess I will ask you if there's a sort of complexity or nuance that you had to gloss over to fit the talk into the time that you would like to expand on.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I guess for one thing is I didn't really even get into, for the seabirds, we also had an analysis looking at assigning risk scores at larger scales to those BOEM planning areas. And we found with that analysis that the western area actually has the highest risk. And that's kind of complicated to explain when you look at that map and see all the high risk in the eastern and central. But it's basically that there is less variability across that western planning area. So when you're smoothing all the variation within an area versus the eastern area that has a lot of low risk area as well as those concentrated high risk, you actually end up in a smoothed out higher risk score in the western area. And then when I think about how we approached the land birds, just giving scores at the broad scale, I feel like we're probably missing hotspots of risk, maybe in like the eastern area that came out low risk for them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I can see. Yeah, it's hard to fit it on to 11 minutes or 12 minutes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. We're going to move on to Julia now, who will be presenting a talk, Assessing Movement Patterns and Habitat Use of Non-Breeding Northern Gannets in the U.S. and Atlantic in relation to environmental conditions and offshore wind development. And I just want to remind folks that you're welcome to put questions in the chat if you want, or hold them till the end. But chat questions are welcome. Thanks. Take it away.
Awesome. You can hear me and see my screen.
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, so my name is Julia Golka. I also work at the Biodiversity Research Institute. I'm our Associate Director for our Center for Research on Offshore Wind and the Environment. And I'm going to be talking today, continuing on the trend of northern gannets, talking about a project we've been working on for a couple of years now as part of the larger Project WOW, or Wildlife and Offshore Wind, which is a big collaborative research project funded by the Department of Energy and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to try to understand how wildlife is responding to the first commercial scale offshore wind in the US. So today I'm going to be focused in on some of the northern gannet movement and behavior analysis we've been doing. So we've already heard throughout this session both how we are thinking about offshore wind as a key kind of renewable energy industry to help reduce carbon emissions and meet clean energy goals, but it's not without its risks to wildlife, including seabirds. And much of what we know about potential effects to seabirds comes from Europe, where offshore wind has been developed for multiple decades now. So we can pull a lot of information from that about behavioral response like avoidance and displacement and potential collision risk. But there is still uncertainty in terms of how transferable those results are to the Northwest Atlantic as turbines continue to get bigger and are further spaced apart. And there are also components of species ecology and food web dynamics that has the potential to influence whether we're seeing that same response over on this side of the ocean. So as the first commercial scale developments are being built in the US Atlantic, we're using GPS data to try to understand how seabirds are responding to this new industry in the region. And we're using northern gannets. As everyone has talked about, their potentially high collision risk given what we know about their flight heights. And European studies have also found high levels of avoidance, but also interestingly, a lot of individual variation in how birds are responding. But many of the studies of gannets in Europe focus on birds breeding in close proximity to wind farms, whereas in the Northwest Atlantic, gannets are breeding up in Atlantic Canada, so they're primarily exposed during the non-breeding season. So our overall objectives are to try to understand both environmental factors influencing movement patterns and dive locations of gannets to improve our overall understanding of risk, and then really try to understand how they're responding to these first wind farms as they're constructed. So to do that, we deployed GPS GSM tags with solar panels and depth recorders on the tails of non-breeding gannets in the winters of 2023 and 2025. We encountered a lot of challenges along the way. Our primary capture method was night spotlighting at sea. In January in the middle of the night, looking for gannets is not for the faint of heart, but we had a great field team work on this project. The other main challenge that we encountered is that gannets molt their tails during the winter, which we didn't have great information on this going into field work about timing. So that was one of the main reasons we actually shifted our second field later, in the hopes that birds were further along in their tail molt and we could get longer tag deployments. We were also able to work with some collaborators at the Nature Conservancy to do some daytime captures towards the end of our tagging using hoop nets, targeting aggregations, which, as you can see from this slide, is much more kind of pleasant conditions to be doing field work. In the end, we deployed 60 tags on gannets, lasted an average of 1 to 2 months, though some of those earlier tags dropped off more quickly. Okay, so what was going on during with offshore wind development during this period? So this map shows all of the planned offshore wind developments in the black outlines with red shaded areas where activities were actively occurring during the tagging period. So I'll just walk through kind of the stage of all of those projects and how we're thinking about this. So first, there are 2 pilot scale projects that were fully operational throughout the whole tagging period. So that's Block Island Wind with 5 turbines and the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project with 2 turbines. Then we have South Fork Wind, which was under construction during our first tagging period with foundations in the water and turbines being built. And then by season 2 was operational. It's on the smaller side with 12 turbines. Vineyard Wind 1 had most of its foundations in the water during season 1 and was starting to build above water components. And then by season 2 had finished foundation installation and made some progress on turbines. But as I'm sure folks saw in the news, they had a blade break incident. And so during season 2, there was a phase in which they both had full turbines, but also turbines without blades as they were going through and replacing those. And then the last 2 projects are Revolution Wind, right next to South Fork, and Seavow, down off the coast of Virginia, neither of which had started construction at all during season 1. But by season 2, Revolution had most of its foundations installed and was beginning to construct turbines. And Seavow only had foundations in the water during season 2. So a bit of a complicated picture. This just shows kind of the overall numbers of foundations and turbines between the 2 seasons. It's not, unfortunately, as simple a story as comparing kind of before and after construction. We're really looking at how birds are responding during construction. So we focused some preliminary analysis on understanding how birds are responding to these developments, focusing on data within 20 kilometers of active leases. From what we know in Europe, this is kind of a greater distance than we might expect to see gannets responding behaviorally to wind farms. And we looked at some kind of behavior metrics and evaluated some habitat preference using resource selection functions. So here are raw tracks in relation to what areas were active within a given season. So in season 1, 3 of our 15 birds were using wind energy areas. You can see on the top left, it's primarily Vineyard Wind 1. And then in 2025, we have 23 of 45 birds using wind areas. You can see a large concentration of activity around Block Island, driving a large portion of this. I will note that we tagged a large number of our birds just west of here. So this was also potentially some tag location bias as well. But we do see some activity in other wind farms during this period. We can also look at where birds are diving, and we see a similar pattern in season 1. So those 3 birds are doing some active foraging within Vineyard Wind 1. And in season 2, we see again that kind of cluster around Block Island, but there is a bit of dive activity in some of the other wind energy areas as well. If we look at speed of birds within and outside of the wind farms, we see overall faster speed distributions within. So they're potentially, for the most part, transiting through as opposed to foraging or resting. We're also seeing higher activity levels in wind farms in the middle of the day, which also supports that idea, as foraging activities tend to be more concentrated in the mornings and the evenings, though definitely happening throughout the day. And we see some evidence of shallower dive depth distributions in the wind farms, which definitely warrants some further investigation as to whether this is reflective of differences in water column depth or an indication of potentially different dive profiles. And then we wanted to start to get into some of the finer scale behavior in relation to individual turbines. So I ran some resource selection functions with distance to turbine as our primary variable of interest, but I also wanted to look at whether birds were responding differently to foundations versus fully built turbines, as you might expect that they would. And also included some primary environmental covariates. These are very preliminary exploratory models, so bear that in mind. But I ran 3 models, first with all active projects calculating distance to nearest turbine location and status of that turbine. Second, I removed the small scale pilot projects to look at just the larger commercial scale projects. And then finally, I removed foundations and calculated distance to the nearest fully built turbine to try to start teasing apart some of these variables of how gannets are responding. So I found high inter-project variance in Model 1, largely driven by Block Island wind, which was part of why I chose to focus the other 2 models on the commercial scale projects, especially given our potential bias of tagging location. Across all 3 models, depth was the most important variable, with birds preferring shallower waters. And in the first 2 models, turbine status, so whether the nearest turbine was a foundation or fully built turbine, was significant. You can see the figure on the top right is what that relationship looked like for Model 1, but similar for Model 2, where birds are showing a lower probability of occurrence near turbines compared to foundations, suggesting that they aren't avoiding foundations. So that was part of what led me to Model 3, to remove foundations and just focus on distance to the nearest fully built turbine to see if foundations were maybe muddling the response we were seeing. Even removing foundations, distance to turbine wasn't significant in any of our models. But if you do look at the density distribution of available versus used locations, there is perhaps a bit of weak avoidance at kind of near distances between 0 and 5 kilometers that warrant some further exploration as we refine our analyses. So lots of caveats, very preliminary. In particular, as you could tell, the 2 seasons of tagging data were very different in terms of timing, number of tagged individuals, and tagging location. So it's going to be really important to account for these variables in our final models. Defining the status of turbines was also really challenging. I was doing that on a monthly basis based on public available information. We're trying to get more detailed information from developers to try to refine our understanding. We're also currently not able to distinguish between turbines that are built versus operational, so whether or not the blades are spinning, which also likely influences how birds are responding. And also, birds are likely not just responding to the individual closest turbine. And also, they may be responding to the construction activities themselves. Most studies of how seabirds respond to offshore wind have kind of a clear before-after study design. We don't have that. It's an opportunity to look at how gannets are responding during construction, but it definitely leads to some challenges in teasing apart what's actually going on. And there are other factors likely contributing to gannet behavior that we haven't yet accounted for. Vessels is a big one. We know gannets are attracted to fishing vessels, so it's possible birds are responding also to the presence of construction vessels that may be interacting with potential behavior in relation to turbines. And there are other environmental covariates we want to explore as well, particularly things like stratification and frontal features that we know are likely a better indicator of resource availability. So that brings me to next steps. Looking forward, we're going to be doing some more complex analyses. We're working on fitting some hidden Markov models to distinguish behavior states and look at how birds are responding to environmental conditions and offshore wind factors. These are also going to be used to inform some behaviorally explicit collision risk models that Michael presented on yesterday. And we're planning to run some step selection functions as well, which have potentially fewer biases than resource selection functions. And this is a great opportunity to also incorporate the dive data we have, flight height information, to really try to better understand how birds are using 3D space. And then finally, we're going to be pulling in some additional tag data from Juliet Lamb at TNC, which is really exciting. And we've also collected a bunch of samples, blood, feathers, and fecal samples for stable isotopes, contaminants, HPAI, eDNA. we took the opportunity of having birds in the hand to collect everything we could to try to build a larger picture of these non-breeding gannet populations. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's so neat to see this work and your preliminary results after hearing about you heading to the field. And it does look like that winter sampling was
in the field this winter, I will say.
Yeah, well, that was going to be one of my questions. Whether or not there was going to be any more sojourns this winter, or if you were done.
Yeah, we're done at this point.
Good.
Yep,
good.
No more tags to deploy at this stage, but
okay, awesome. All right, well, I will hold my other questions. Oh, we've got one from Caleb here, maybe.
Yeah, do we have time? I guess I can. Well, we don't have time. I'll just hold off until after. Actually,
that'd be great.
And then we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stay on time. We're doing so well. Okay, great. So I'm going to invite Juliet Lamb then to start your talk. Juliet is going to be presenting a talk entitled Concurrent Tracking of Multiple Seabird Species to Inform Offshore Wind Energy Development in the New York Bight. Hi.
It's working on getting it into Teams.
No worries. No worries. I'll stay here just long enough to let you know it's working. If you end up having issues, I can present from here. You just won't have your speaker notes.
All right. It claims it's loading the file in PowerPoint Live.
Great. We're on schedule, so there's no worries here.
I can talk fast.
I feel like we should have like elevator music playing in the background.
Well, if anyone has another question for Julia while she's here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we can do that. Caleb, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, Julia, great talk. It's good to see the results of the gannet tracking that you guys did. I'm wondering if, and I would imagine that it's probably would be pretty tricky, but is there any thought, or have you looked at that historic diving bird study gannet data and just looked at whether or not there was any differences? Maybe the scale is not maybe the same or comparable, but I'm just wondering about that. They were also tagged in a different place, but
yeah, we haven't looked at that yet, but it's a great opportunity to compare them, given that, the diving bird study, we have like the long, full migration movement patterns, whereas we have this finer resolution information from the GPS tag. So I think they have the potential to complement each other. We haven't looked at it yet, but definitely interested in it.
Yeah, and I'm just curious to know whether or not there would be any differences in, we did have birds using that area a fair amount because we had a fairly large sample size. So there is a fair amount of data for that area, even though it's pretty brief because they were moving through. But anyway, I just was curious, and that would be kind of neat to see.
Yep.
All right, Stephanie, maybe I'll ask you to share because it's still stuck on this loading screen.
No worries. Okay. You can also present your screen if you want to go into presenter view and do it that way. But otherwise, I will go ahead and.
Oh, hold on. Oh,
sorry about that, Juliet. I feel like our new AI is messing things up for everyone.
Okay. Oh wait, it said it was going to share and then it didn't. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. We have a 10-minute period for questions at the end. Of this, and no questions in the chat. So
no, this time it came straight through. So whatever was going on before doesn't seem to be going on now. Okay. Great. Well, I will.
It's not presenting just yet.
Ah, man. Yeah, it keeps saying it's doing it and then not.
Yeah, now we see your. So in the top somewhere, you should have the ability to change which screen is sharing. Right now, we're seeing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that option?
Yes. No.
Well, why don't I do this?
All right, thanks. That works.
Okay, great.
Whatever. Okay.
Yay, it works.
Yay. All right, great. So Juliet Lamb with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to give you kind of the 10,000-foot view of a bunch of different interrelated tracking projects that we're working on to better understand habitat use of a suite of seabirds in the New York Bight. Next slide. So I'm shamelessly stealing this brand new figure that Ian Stenhouse made for a paper that we're working on right now on displacement effects, basically to show the importance of annual cycle tracking for understanding effects of offshore wind development on marine birds. So exposure can happen across various periods of the annual cycle, from terrestrial breeding sites through fall and spring migrations and down to non-breeding areas. And because of, the energetic requirements of birds, these different periods can impact populations and individuals differently. Next. So locations can be important. So you get hotspot effects where certain areas create greater exposure and potentially greater risk. Next. We also have hot moments. So periods of the annual cycle where birds might be more sensitive to effects. And finally, next, we also have hot birds, which, still workshopping that, but individuals who are at greater risk because of their behavior, and potentially groups of individuals across species that might be at greater risk. And if you're going only based on survey data, it's really hard to identify particularly these individual sources of variation, where certain groups of individuals may be more vulnerable than others. But those effects can really scale up to demographic patterns and impact populations in ways that may be difficult to quantify. So using individual tracking is really helpful to get at those kinds of sources of variation. So this is the New York Bight. We're looking at the area from southern New England down through the coast of New Jersey. And this area is also kind of the ground zero for offshore wind energy development in the Atlantic United States and North America. So we currently have 5 wind farms that are either active or under construction. Despite a lot of lease areas being paused at the moment, these other projects are still moving forward. And I would say optimistically, and because of market forces, I don't think this pause is forever. So we'll probably see some of these other projects starting up again at some point in the future. So it's really important to understand how birds in this area might be exposed not only to individual wind projects, but to the cumulative effects of these large-scale developments. Next. So we're focusing on 5 different focal species. The first 2 are non-breeding species that provide nice complements to one another. So northern gannets are present in the New York Bight during our winter, which is their non-breeding period. And great shearwaters are present during our summer, which is their non-breeding period, before they migrate down to the southern hemisphere to breed during our winter. Next. We also have year-round residents, the great black-backed gull, that we've been tracking from 2 different colonies in Long Island Sound and Rhode Island. Next. And we have 2 species that are present only during the breeding season, so the common tern and roseate tern breeding on Great Gull Island. Next. So all of this work across the 5 species, we've been working over a little over 2 years on these projects. We've tracked over 100 individuals and gotten over 1 million individual locations. So it's a really great kind of comprehensive look at what these birds are doing across large scale space and time. Next. And just to go into a little detail on the tracking devices, because I know you're probably interested, so go ahead. So for gannets, we used Ornitell Ornitrack 30 tags, tail tape attachment, and we had durations of about 3 to 4 months before birds molted tail feathers, as Julia explained. Next. For shearwaters, we've been using leg loop harnesses. Sorry, the actual transmitters are Druids for these birds, and they're about 10 grams. And we've been getting about 3 to 8 months duration from those tags. Next. For the black-backed gulls, we've been using PathTrack GPS GSM tags. So these report to the cell tower network. These are attached using a backpack harness that crosses at the sternum. And we've been getting between 8 and 18 months of data from these birds. Next. For common terns, we've used 2 different tags. So the PathTrack NanoFix, which upload to base stations, and also more recently the Ornitella Ornitrack 3. So these are 3-gram GSM uploading tags. We've been using leg loop harnesses, and we've been getting around 6 months of data from these birds in most cases. And then roseate terns, we've only been using the PathTrack tags with a similar attachment method and duration. Next. So I'm just going to show you, because I can, some videos of catching shearwaters. So we had to figure out how to do this in the New York Bight, where densities are kind of lower than what you get further north, for those of you who are familiar. So we ended up using these floating hoop nets, and you can see it takes a few different attempts before you can actually successfully catch a bird sometimes with these. But we've been having pretty good success with them. And we did try like some other things like chumming and dip netting, and just didn't get anywhere with those. So this hoop net ended up being what worked. Next. So this is the unsuccessful attempts, and now you can see the successful attempt, which is pretty cool. So I'm just gonna, hopefully the video is working. Oh no, it's unsuccessful attempts again. Can we move on to the next slide, hopefully? No.
Sorry, are they, I'm not sure I'm.
There should be, yeah, okay,
here we
this
go.
is the next
Sorry,
video. Thank you.
Pardon me.
That is my fault for putting videos in a presentation.
No, I love it. They're working really well.
Here's the end of the day. People maybe want to see some videos. All right, so yeah, this is our successful attempt. Woohoo, we got it. And so we'll kind of back the boat up toward the bird and hook it in with the gaff hook. And we actually use these same hoop nets for catching gannets during the day. So this technique has ended up working pretty well for our non-breeding birds. So for anyone who's kind of curious about getting these birds that we're not catching on colonies, this is how we've been doing it. And this is a nice example because the bird's not too tangled. So you pull it out, you can just get the wing out of the net pretty easily. And then, yeah, do all your processing and transmitter attachment. All right, so what this looks like across all the 5 species. So we've gotten tracks covering pretty big swath of the New York Bight, honestly. And yeah, it's a lot of work for sure, and a lot of birds. Next. And beyond, obviously. So we've got terns migrating down as far as the Caribbean. We tracked 1 roseate tern down to South America so far. With shearwaters migrating to the Southern Hemisphere, which I'll show you momentarily, and then gannets migrating up to Atlantic Canada. Next. All right, so I'll very quickly talk through some of our results. So first of all, looking at the gannet data, this is some work we recently published in Ornithological Applications. I think the paper came out last month, looking at sort of microscale temporal variation. So this is looking at the division of behaviors. So we used a hidden Markov model to pull out resting versus foraging versus commuting behaviors. Next. What you can see here is there's a big spike in both foraging and commuting activity right at the start of the day. So the night up until, you've got hour on the x-axis here, they're pretty much just resting with very little movement. But right around 6 or 7 a.m., they start to really move. And that's kind of a potential hotspot of where birds are moving from offshore roosting areas that they occupy during the night to inshore foraging areas, and possibly passing through wind energy developments. Next. We also looked at birds that we captured early in the winter versus later in the winter, sort of early spring. Next, and what we see here is that in spring, we get higher levels of foraging and lower levels of commuting. So when birds are first arriving into the area in early winter, they're moving around a lot, finding good foraging spots. And then in the spring, they're really focused on foraging and getting up their energy resources for migration, with a lot less of the kind of moving around and commuting. So again, when you're thinking about hotspots in terms of birds moving through wind energy areas, that kind of early winter period seems to be the highest level of activity. Next. And what we see also is between these 3 behavioral states. So I mentioned birds roosting offshore. We saw higher overlap with lease areas during resting. Next. Very little overlap during foraging, which tends to happen closer to shore. Next. And kind of moderate levels of overlap with commuting behavior. So depending on what behaviors birds are engaged in, overlap with wind-lease areas appears to vary. Next. And then finally, we saw that behavior inside relative to outside wind energy developments changed between the early and the late winter. So in early winter, we saw higher levels of resting and roosting within wind energy areas compared to outside them. And in spring, we saw higher levels of commuting. So although commuting behavior was lower later in the spring, it was actually higher within wind energy areas. So there's kind of this micro scale variation that can affect exposure. Next. So moving on to great blackback gulls, we tracked gulls from 2 different colonies, and we found that there was actually, we tracked birds during the period when Revolution Wind was under construction, and we saw this pattern of attraction to the construction process at that area. So this is kind of anecdotal, but interesting. But basically what I want you to focus on here is these 2 different colonies, so Block Island in red and South Dumpling in blue. Given gull foraging ranges, the South Dumpling birds could easily have been going to Revolution Wind as well, but we only saw Block Island birds going there. And we actually saw this very clear distinction between the foraging areas used by the 2 colonies that appears to be sort of a territorial exclusion that's happening there. So the location of colony sites where birds are breeding can really affect whether or not they're being exposed to these wind-lease areas. Next. We also saw that sex was really important for great blackback gulls. So all of the females that we tracked migrated during the non-breeding period, whereas most of the males that we tracked remained resident. Next. But even the resident males were not doing the same thing during the winter as during the spring, and as during the breeding season. Sorry, next. So we get this this dispersal of females, both north and south, but tending to remain fairly close to the coast during the non-breeding period. Next. Whereas in December through March, we saw males starting to move offshore and actually use the shelf break for foraging, which they didn't do during the breeding season. Next. So this is a secondary example from Great Shearwater, sorry, looking at interannual variation. So we've tracked shearwaters in 2 years, 2024 and 2025. In 2024, we saw activity mostly concentrated in the New York Bight, moving southward from the area where we caught them off Montauk, with a little bit of activity sort of further east, but really nothing north of Cape Cod. So we sort of thought, oh, this is interesting, like compared to the birds that have been tracked off Stellwagen Bank, they're really focusing on the New York Bight area, and these birds are kind of staying in the area. So if we just stop there, great, good story. Next. But then we tracked them in 2025 and saw a completely different picture. So the birds that we're catching in the New York Bight were actually going offshore, moving further north, and overlapping pretty like thoroughly with the areas being used by the birds captured off Stellwagen Bank. So this really shows that understanding movement across multiple years is really key to knowing like what the potential risks are and what the distribution among populations is. Next. We also tracked the 2 species of terns, and I won't talk too much about this because Peter Payton is going to be talking about this tomorrow in the roseate tern session. Next. But in the context of interannual variation, I did want to mention that we also saw that between 2024 and 2025, there was a big increase in foraging habitat area for both tern species. So understanding these kind of multi-species patterns, like it seemed like there was a poor food year happening in 2025 in the New York Bight that impacted different species differently. So for shearwaters, we had them moving further offshore and out of the New York Bight. For terns that were central place foragers at the breeding site, we had them moving further away from the breeding site. So this is an advantage of tracking both breeding and non-breeding species across multiple years, is understanding how conditions can impact these species differently. Next. So we also are interested in how do we mitigate risks. So one thing that we found with the gulls as they started to move offshore was that they were pretty heavily using this circled area. Next. Which is also a fishing hotspot. Based on Global Fishing Watch data, we found heavy fishing activity there. So what is this area? Next. This is the Hudson Canyon, and the Hudson Canyon is currently under consideration as a national marine sanctuary. So there are opportunities for protecting key habitats at sea for species that are using these areas. Next. And then also tracking these migratory birds to match non-breeding habitat with breeding habitat. So we see the gannets mostly migrating to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Next. And the shearwaters, migrating across the ocean and then down south to South America and using habitats off the coast of Uruguay. Next. All right, so just to summarize, next. So we see pretty large interannual variation across all of the species that we looked at in at-sea habitat use. And this really shows that a short-term study of 1 year or even 1 week or within a year is not going to give you a full picture of what's going on. We also see shifts in foraging behavior within seasons, depending on the timing within the season. We see that for breeders, the colony size and location matter, and within colony strategies tend to be pretty consistent among individuals, but for non-breeders, we see a lot of interindividual variation and segregation among species and sexes. Next. So finally, for next steps, I didn't talk much about habitat, but we're working on integrating a lot of this data with habitat associations to understand the drivers of marine foraging behavior, collaborating with other teams like the work that Julia mentioned at BRI, with the NOAA team that Liam Waters is working on for shearwaters, and also with marine mammal tracking that's happening in the New York Bight to really understand foraging associations, looking at migratory strategies and what's driving the use of different migratory routes, which you could see from some of those slides that there's a lot of variation. And then finally adding some more external data as we continue tracking. So prey sampling, physiological sampling, and then looking at accelerometry data. All right, so that was quick and I'm still over time, but I do want to put in one final plug, which is that we are currently I'm working with Jacob Gonzalez Solis at University of Barcelona to collect data on long-term device attachments. So anyone who's working with long-term device attachments in seabirds, we have a survey. We're doing a workshop at the World Seabird Conference. So if you can't grab that QR code, just send me a message and I can send you the survey. All right, that's it from me. Thank you.
You're amazing. That was a really great talk, and it's so much effort. So much effort has gone into that. I'm going to invite all of the speakers for this session now to turn on your cameras. And we've got 5 minutes for questions. And if there's any people in the audience who would like to ask a question, you are also welcome to turn on your camera and ask your question. Don't have any in the chat. Oh, here we go. There's Caleb. I've got questions, but please go first.
Yeah, sure. I'll ask a question, but I also want to say, come on, people, you can't all be sleeping. It's we have another hour to go. No, I was just asked. I had a question for Greg actually. See, Greg is on. How you doing, Greg? My question is, I'm assuming that you're these multi-sensor arrays, they're commercially available? Is that, or are you still in the testing? Yeah, they're commercially available. Have you done have you done any kind of I mean, you mentioned like the fact that that it would be expensive that observational surveys can be expensive, particularly if you're looking at like a pretty extensive pre and post construction design. Do you have you heard of different cost comparisons between installing multi-sensor arrays where you have, you pay upfront and then you have the equipment and then it's going versus, a series of observational surveys? I'm just wondering if that's something that you've done or heard about, and in which case I'm curious about what the results would be of that.
We haven't done an actual comparison of equipment versus the Seabird Observer, but there'd be a lot of different variables that you'd have to consider. The extent of the study, how many sensors, how many observers, and so forth. So, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea. And I guess how would you adjust for the fact that the humans can only survey so long and the remote sensing equipment can survey all day and night? But it's definitely an interesting idea.
Well, and also it would maybe take into account just kind of what you were seeing, which is that there is a limitation in observers that is, that you have shown that is not there in actual equipment on the facilities themselves. I think you showed that pretty well in your presentation. So I don't know if it would be like a cost per like bird like locate, observed or something like that. But I just was wondering about that because it'd be interesting.
Maybe cost per volume of airspace surveyed or something. And I don't even know how you would quantify that, but yeah, it's a good, it's definitely a good question.
That was going to be my question for you, actually, how the cost of sensor arrays compared to traditional human observers. Okay, so I've got a different question for you, Greg, and that is, where are we on the cost curve with this technology? Like, is being an early adopter still expensive? Is it becoming more reasonable? Can we replace human observers with cameras readily?
Yeah, we brought the cost down quite a bit from when we started in the 2011 study on frying pan shoals. We've got the equipment is smaller, it's less expensive, and we're using components now that don't require a separate water resistant or weather resistant housing now. So that reduced both costs and just the space that the equipment occupies on the platform.
Okay. Great, thanks. Do we have any questions from the audience for Julia or Kyla? Juliet? Not? Well, I think we're going to just take, we are supposed to break now. If you need to break, please do. If you would like to stay and listen to questions and answers for just a couple more minutes, we're going to just go a couple minutes over here. So Julia, I was wondering, can you talk a little bit more about that? You mentioned the shallower dive depth distributions within the wind farms, and it seemed like you maybe wanted to say a little bit more, but didn't have the time to get into it. So
yeah,
do you want to just take a minute?
Yeah, it's just very preliminary at this point. We're trying to fit some more complex models to really get a better sense of how birds are behaving. So just take that with a grain of salt. I mean, I don't think it's particularly surprising that gannets use shallow waters generally. But yeah, thinking about how that depth profile differs within wind energy areas and maybe in areas closer to shore is an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Leaving opportunities here for people. Okay.
I think there was a question for you, Stephanie. I don't know if you.
Oh, is there? Let me moderate myself. Okay.
Can you explain how some of the risk factors used in the models may stack and therefore have an additive effect across the metrics?
Stacking, additive. Yeah, that is in fact the only kind of interaction we are dealing with right now. We are interested in interactions and, have contemplated using structural equation models, but we don't have time for that in this iteration of the project. So we're using a light pollution layer that includes light pollution from vessel traffic and terrestrial sources. So we have our light pollution layer, we have our fisheries landings, which is what we're using as a proxy for bycatch, because we don't have bycatch layer, although one may or may not be in development. I need to circle back and talk to April Head. And then we've got vessel traffic separately. So, I mean, these things are they're different pressures, which have different effects in our model, and they're all represented by different data types. If you want to dig into that a little bit more, please come on and talk to me. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next question.
Hey Stephanie, no, that was me. I think you covered it. Okay. Yeah, I know of the bycatch layer that you're talking about that April has in development, but yeah, I think you answered the question. It looked like when you showed the 4 maps that included light pollution and vessel traffic and everything, it didn't look like the light pollution layer sort of correlated well with the vessel traffic. So I just wanted to ask that question.
Right. But, yeah, fair enough. So vessel traffic is just one light source. Right. One part of the light source, and everything's also weighted. So based on sensitivity, to which Gannets had a fairly low relative weighting. Okay, so we've got one last question. I think here we'll do for Juliet. Oh, that's from Caleb. No, let's ask a question from someone else. Except no, we want to ask a question to Juliet. So here we go. Kate, there we go. Maybe trying to distribute the questions. Juliet, maybe you haven't done this yet, but how do your great blackback gull data compare with Esther's from Stony Brook? Do you continue to see separation of foraging habitat by colony location when looking at additional colonies?
We haven't integrated those data yet, but we are discussing it, and like expanding to more colonies would be great, because we also saw a colony effect on foraging footprint and migration footprint. So birds from the larger colony at Block Island were foraging further distances, which is consistent with the Ashmole's halo sort of local prey depletion, and also migrating further distances. So I'm really eager to integrate data from other gull colonies to see if those patterns hold up, and then to see if this territorial kind of exclusion that we were seeing between these two colonies holds up. But one thing that's interesting about the territorial exclusion is that a kind of side application of this is to look at whether gulls are preying on terns at Great Gull Island, and we saw that basically both of these colonies didn't overlap at all with Great Gull Island, and there's an additional gull colony between the South Dumpling Island colony and Great Gull that's probably causing that because of this territorial exclusion. Like, that seems to be part of their foraging territory, so the South Dumpling Island birds aren't going there. So also trying to get some tracking data from that colony if we can. It's privately owned, but I'm still hopeful that one day we'll get out there. So yeah, that's definitely part of on the horizon for gulls, is expanding to more colonies and trying to get a more comprehensive picture of what that looks like.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, well, so it's 4:30 for me, 3:30 for you, most of you. So I think we're going to close it there and move on to what will now be a 5-minute break instead of a 10-minute break. So please come back at 35 past the hour for the Tracking Studies Part 1 session.
Yeah, and thanks a lot, Stephanie, for leading the session, and to all